Hey there, story lovers. This is Watch Harry, and we're bringing you an epic adventure. Petunia discovered Vernon was a squib and used old Muggle law to strip Dumbledore of 17 magical rights. Hit like, subscribe, and let's begin this journey. Chapter 1, The Letter and the Floorboards. The thing about Petunia Dursley was that she noticed everything. She had always been this way, even as a girl growing up in the Evans household in Cokeworth, where noticing things was the only real defense a person had. You noticed when your father's jaw tightened before he said something that would hurt. You noticed when your sister came home with her shoes wet and her eyes too bright and her hands smelling faintly of something that wasn't quite anything you could name. You noticed the small shifts in the air that preceded disaster, and you catalogued them, and you filed them away in the orderly cabinet of your mind, and you waited. 30 years of marriage to Vernon Dursley had not changed this about her. If anything, it had sharpened it. So when Vernon began sleeping badly in February of the year Harry turned 11, Petunia noticed. She noticed the 3 a.m. trips downstairs that he explained away as thirst. She noticed the way he checked his study door twice before he left for Grunnings each morning, a new habit, the slight pause with his hand on the knob, the small exhale of relief when the lock held. She noticed the way he had begun reading the Post before she could see it, which he had never done in 30 years, because Vernon Dursley had always considered the Morning Post a communal domestic event, something to be exclaimed over with tea and marmalade toast. She did not say anything. She filed it away and she waited. The waiting ended on a Thursday morning in March when Dudley knocked over Vernon's golf bag in the hallway and 3 iron clubs and a scuffed white shoe went sliding across the parquet, and in the scramble to retrieve them Petunia noticed a scuff mark on the skirting board near the study door that was too perfectly rectangular to be accidental. She waited until Dudley was at school and Vernon was at work. Then she got on her hands and knees in the hallway and pressed the skirting board with her palm. It swung inward on a small hinge. Behind it was a cavity barely larger than a shoebox. Inside the cavity was a bundle of letters held together with a rubber band so old it had begun to crack, and a small glass bottle filled with a fine gray powder that smelled, when she opened it, like the air before lightning. Petunia sat on the hallway floor for a long time. Then she took the bundle and the bottle upstairs to the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and began to read. The letters were in order, oldest to newest, spanning, she checked the dates twice, then a third time, 23 years. The earliest was dated 3 months before their wedding. The handwriting on the outside of the first envelope was not Vernon's. It was small and neat and slightly angular, the handwriting of someone who had been taught to write with precision. The return address, where there should have been a street number and a postcode, said only, The Office of Magical Records, Ministry of Magic, Whitehall, concealed an X. Petunia's hands were very steady as she unfolded it. The letter was formal and bureaucratic, the language of someone who dealt in administrative unpleasantries for a living. It confirmed receipt of Mr. Vernon Bertram Dursley's application for voluntary magical suppression registration under Section 14 of the Registry of Non-Practicing Magical Persons Act, 1953. It confirmed that following blood assessment conducted by ministry healers on the 14th of October, Mr. Dursley had been classified as a squib, Category 2, latent, non-manifesting, meaning that while magical blood was detectably present in his lineage, no active magical ability had manifested and was highly unlikely to do so. It confirmed that in accordance with Mr. Dursley's request, this registration had been sealed under a Muggle-accessible privacy clause and that no ministry communication would be sent to the applicant's registered Muggle address without explicit prior consent. It confirmed, at the very bottom of the page in smaller type, that the applicant had been advised of his rights under the 1612 Muggle-born and blood-adjacent protection statute and had formally declined all 17 provisions. Petunia read that last paragraph 4 times. She set the letter down on the duvet. She looked at the wall for approximately 30 seconds. Then she picked up the next letter. By the time she had read them all, the correspondence spanning 3 decades, the occasional ministry updates on his registration status, 2 formal notices about blood-adjacent family members entering the magical world that he had signed and returned with a box checked indicating no contact required, And one deeply uncomfortable letter from what appeared to be a Squib support organization in Edinburgh that he had never replied to. The bedroom had gone dark around her and the streetlights had come on outside. She got up, went to the bathroom, ran cold water over her wrists, and looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. The woman who looked back at her was 51 years old. She had a narrow face and blonde hair going silver at the temples and eyes that were neither warm nor cold but watchful in a way that most people mistook for disapproval. She had spent her entire adult life performing a very specific role: Muggle housewife, ordinary woman, no connection to anything strange or abnormal, absolutely nothing to see here. She had done it so thoroughly, so completely, that she had sometimes, in the dark, in the small hours, wondered if she had simply become the performance. If there was anything left underneath it. The woman in the mirror looked considerably less uncertain than she had this morning. 2 notices about blood-adjacent family members entering the magical world. She knew exactly what those were. She had been there for both of them. She remembered the day Lily's Hogwarts letter came. She remembered the day Harry's did. Vernon had known. Vernon had always known. Not just that magic was real, she'd told him that herself, on their second date, because she was not a woman who kept secrets from the man she intended to marry, but that he was part of it. That his blood carried the same quiet heritage that Lily's had carried, that Harry's carried. That when the ministry classified people for its various registries and statutes and protections, Vernon Dursley was not a wholly Muggle bystander. He was Category 2. He was theirs, whether he wanted to be or not. And he had declined all 17 provisions. For himself. Which meant, she would need to check, she would need to be absolutely certain, but she was already quite sure, that he had made that decision on behalf of blood-adjacent family members who might have had a rather strong opinion about it if they'd been asked. She dried her hands. She went downstairs. She started making dinner. When Vernon came home at 6:15, she put his plate in front of him, poured his beer, and sat across from him with her own cup of tea and watched him eat. He talked about something that had happened at Grunnings with a supplier. He complained about the roadworks on the A3. He said something about Dudley wanting a new video game and that the boy had been doing well enough in school that perhaps it was warranted. Petunia said in all the right places and watched his face and thought, "You knew when we took Harry in that you were blood adjacent to the magical world. You knew you had rights. You chose to give them up without asking me. Without telling me. Without telling Harry." "You're quiet tonight," Vernon said, reaching for his beer. "Long day," Petunia said. He nodded, entirely satisfied with this, and went back to his dinner, and Petunia looked at the bundle of letters she had replaced behind the skirting board and decided that she was going to need a solicitor. Not a Muggle one. Harry Potter was in the garden when his aunt came out the back door with a cup of tea and sat on the step beside him, which was unusual enough that he immediately looked for signs of incoming trouble. She wasn't holding a list of chores. She wasn't wearing the expression she wore when she'd found something broken or dirty or out of place. She was just sitting there, steam rising from her cup, looking at the narrow strip of lawn with a thoughtful expression he didn't think he'd seen on her before. Harry had been prodding a beetle with a stick. He put the stick down. "Your Hogwarts letter will likely arrive in the next few months," Petunia said. Harry opened his mouth. Closed it. "Don't look like a fish," she said, not unkindly. "I know about Hogwarts. I know about all of it. I have known since before you were born. You never," he stopped. Started again. "You said Mum was a freak." The word landed between them like a stone in water. He watched her face for the flinch, but what happened instead was more interesting, a tightening around the eyes that looked less like shame and more like old grief pressing against a door that had been closed a very long time. "I said a number of things I shouldn't have," she said. "I was angry, and I was frightened, and I took those things out on you, which was wrong. I am telling you this now, not so that you'll thank me for it, but because things are going to change and you need to understand something about why. Harry looked at her. He was 10 years old, almost 11, and he was sitting in the garden of number 4 Privet Drive having what was unquestionably the strangest conversation of his life, and his aunt was looking at him with an expression that was not warmth, exactly, but was something adjacent to it, something that had the same weight as warmth but had never learned how to move properly. "What's changing?" he asked. "A great deal," she said. "But first, are you well? At school? With," she paused, seemed to select her words, "with the things that happen around you sometimes." He considered lying. It was his default with Dursleys, an automatic self-protective reflex as deep-seated as breathing. But there was something in her face tonight that stopped him. "I don't mean to make things happen," he said. "They just do." "I know." She looked at her tea. "Your mother was the same, when she was small. Before she had any training. She set the kitchen curtains on fire once and cried for an hour about it." The image was so unexpected, his mother, young, frightened, crying over something she'd accidentally done, that Harry felt a peculiar tightening in his chest. Nobody ever told him things like that. Nobody ever made his mother real. "She sounds like she was brilliant," he said, very quietly. "She was the cleverest person I ever knew," Petunia said, and her voice was level and she did not look at him, but the level tone cost her something. He could see that. Infuriatingly so. "She could charm the birds out of the trees, your mother, and she didn't even have to try." They sat in the cooling spring evening, and Harry listened to the sound of the neighbor's television through the fence and thought that whatever was coming next was probably enormous. "I'm going to need you to trust me," Petunia said eventually. "Not blindly. I haven't earned blind trust and I'm not asking for it. But I need you to follow my lead on some things without arguing until I have a chance to explain the full picture. Can you do that?" Harry thought about it seriously. That was the thing about Petunia, she was watching him think, and he had the feeling that if he just said yes without actually considering it, she would know, and she would think less of him for it. "If you explain things as you go," he said. "I'm not good at just doing what I'm told without knowing why." Something shifted in her expression. It might have been approval. "Good," she said. "Neither am I." She found the solicitor through the letters. The second-to-last letter in Vernon's bundle had been from a Squib legal advocate, not the Edinburgh Support Organisation, a different one, this one based in London, who had reached out to Vernon following the second blood-adjacent family member notification, which had been about Harry. The advocate's name was Millicent Hobb, and her stationery had an address in Bermondsey that looked Muggle from the outside, which was presumably the point. Petunia went on a Wednesday when Dudley was at school and Vernon was in Birmingham for a Grunnings conference. She brought the letters, a legal pad she'd already begun filling with notes, and the glass bottle of grey powder, which she wrapped in a tea towel and carried in her handbag. The building in Bermondsey was sandwiched between a dry cleaner and a shop selling mobile phones. The sign above the door said Hobb and Associates, Consultants. Inside, a young man with very neat hair and ink on his fingers asked her to wait, and she sat in a chair with her handbag on her lap and her legal pad open and wrote 3 more things she needed to check while she waited. Millicent Hobb was 60-something, powerfully built, with cropped grey hair and reading glasses on a chain and the manner of someone who had been winning difficult arguments for so long that losing had become genuinely foreign to her. She was a Squib herself, she told Petunia this in the first 90 seconds, not as an apology or a disclaimer but simply as relevant professional context, and she had been practicing blood-adjacent magical law for 31 years. "You're the Muggle wife," she said, looking at the letters spread across her desk. "I was unaware I was a Muggle wife at the time of the marriage," Petunia said. "I was aware I was marrying a man with no magic. I was not aware that the absence of manifested magic and the absence of magical blood are 2 entirely different things. Had I known that my husband was classified as blood-adjacent by the Ministry of Magic, I would have been considerably better informed about my own situation." Millicent looked at her over the reading glasses. "Your own situation. I am the sister of Lily Potter, née Evans. A Muggle-born witch. My nephew is Harry Potter. Both of those facts give me a specific legal standing that I was never informed about. She paused. Not by my husband. Not by the ministry. And specifically not by Albus Dumbledore, who placed my nephew in my care without ever mentioning that the placement had legal dimensions beyond the blood wards. Millicent Hobb was quiet for a moment. You've done research, she said. I've done some, Petunia said. I need someone to tell me if I've done it correctly. Millicent pulled the top letter toward her, read it, picked up the next one. She read in silence for several minutes while Petunia sat very still and did not fidget. Then Millicent set the letters down and looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile but contained the same essential energy. The 1612 statute, she said. 17 provisions, Petunia said. Your client, my husband, formally declined all 17 on his own behalf. I need to understand whether that declination applied to family members who had no knowledge of it. It didn't, Millicent said immediately. A blood-adjacent individual can decline rights on their own behalf. They cannot decline rights on behalf of other affected family members. That would require specific written consent from each individual. She paused. Did your husband obtain your written consent? He did not, Petunia said. He did not obtain it because he did not tell me he was blood adjacent. He did not tell me about the registry, the classification, the statute, or the 17 provisions. I have lived for 30 years in a state of legal ignorance that was partly cultivated by my husband and partly, and this is what interests me most, cultivated by Dumbledore's post-war maneuvering, which is how those 17 provisions came to be buried in the first place. Millicent Hobb took off her reading glasses and set them on the desk. She looked at Petunia with the particular attention of someone recalibrating. Where did you learn about Dumbledore's role in the statute suppression? She asked. I'm thorough, Petunia said. You're going to need witnesses. You're going to need documentation from ministry archives that Dumbledore will try to have sealed. You're going to need a Wisengamot advocate, not just a blood-adjacent consultant, and that's a very different and considerably more expensive thing. I'm aware, Petunia said. What I need from you today is confirmation that I'm reading the statute correctly and a referral to the best Wisengamot advocate in Britain who isn't already in Dumbledore's pocket. Millicent looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up her reading glasses and put them back on and reached for a notepad. There are two, she said. One is retired and wouldn't touch it. The other is a goblin. Petunia didn't even blink. The goblin, she said. She told Harry that evening. Not everything, not yet, but enough. She sat him down at the kitchen table after dinner, after Dudley had gone upstairs and Vernon was in his study with the door closed, and she put the legal pad on the table between them and explained, in clear language, what a squib was and what blood adjacent meant and what the 1612 statute contained. Harry listened without interrupting. He had a very particular quality of stillness when he was thinking hard, she'd noticed. He went absolutely quiet, his eyes focused on something slightly past her shoulder, as if he was playing the information on an internal screen and watching it. He looked like Lily when he did that. He looked like Lily constantly, actually, but she had gotten better at not flinching about it. So these 17 rights, he said when she finished. They're rights that Muggle-born families are supposed to have. Legal protections. We're supposed to have, she said. Dumbledore and his allies pushed through a set of post-war reforms that effectively buried the statute. Not repealed, he didn't have enough political capital for a full repeal and there would have been too many questions. He had it reclassified as superseded by newer legislation, which meant it stayed on the books but stopped being enforced or taught. Most people who might have benefited from it simply didn't know it existed. What does it give us? Harry asked. The us was careful and deliberate and she heard it and noted it. The right to magical education consultation before a child's Hogwarts placement, she said. The right to know about the blood wards that were placed on this house, their nature, their cost, their limitations. The right to be informed of any ministry decisions affecting our household. The right to compensation when those decisions cause measurable harm. She paused. 11 years of uninformed wardship, Harry. 11 years during which this household was being used as a magical anchor point without our knowledge or consent. He was quiet again, that focused stillness. Then, Dumbledore knew about Uncle Vernon? That's the question I can't answer yet, she said. He knew about me, knew I was Lily's sister, knew I was Muggle. Whether he knew about Vernon's blood-adjacent status is something we need to establish. But even if he didn't know, he was still obligated under the statute to inform me of my rights before placing you here. He didn't. Harry turned the legal pad around and read her notes. She let him. His eyes moved quickly down the page. Who's the goblin advocate? He asked. Someone I haven't met yet. I have a meeting at Gringotts next week. I want to come, he said. She had expected this. Gringotts is a wizarding bank. There will be magic involved. I know what Gringotts is, he said flatly, not unkindly, just establishing a fact. I want to come. She looked at him across the table, this narrow-shouldered, perpetually too small boy with his cracked glasses and his lily eyes, and thought that she had spent 11 years managing him, containing him, reducing him to something that fit neatly into the Dursley household without spilling over. It hadn't worked. He had never been containable. She saw that clearly now, in a way that didn't frighten her the way it once had. All right, she said. You come. That night she heard Vernon on the stairs at 3 a.m, and she lay in the dark and listened to him go down and heard, faintly, the sound of the study door. She thought about 30 years. She thought about the man she had married, solid and certain and sometimes unkind but never, she had never thought, duplicitous. She had known things about Vernon that she was not proud to know. She had seen him be cruel to Harry in small accumulated ways that she had allowed out of her own complicated grief and fear. She was not trying to rewrite any of that. But this was different. This was a man who had known that his wife was the sister of a Muggle-born witch. Who had known that their household was blood-adjacent. Who had received 2 official notifications about magical family members entering the wizarding world and had filed them away behind a skirting board with a rubber band around them and said absolutely nothing. She thought about the bottle of grey powder. She hadn't asked Millicent about it yet. She had a feeling she already knew what it was. She had read enough, these past weeks, in the books she'd been quietly ordering online and the archives she'd found that the magical world had carelessly half-digitized. Suppression powder. Something a frightened Squib might keep close in case the latent magic in his blood decided to do something noticeable. Something Vernon had presumably been carrying since before they married and had never, not once, mentioned. She thought about how afraid he must have been. She thought about the world she had grown up in, the Muggle world, which had its own rigid hierarchies and its own punishments for people who didn't fit the categories they were born into, and she understood, genuinely, how a man with dormant magical blood and no magical ability might decide that the safest possible life was one in which nobody knew. She understood it. She even pitied it, a little. But understanding a thing and accepting its consequences were not the same thing, and she had a nephew who had slept in a cupboard for the first 6 years of his life in a house that the magical world had been using as an anchor point, and nobody had ever asked her permission, and she was done being ignorant. She heard Vernon come back upstairs. She heard him pause outside the bedroom door. Then he went in. She felt the mattress shift as he climbed in beside her. "You're awake," he said. "Yes," she said. A pause. "Everything all right?" "Fine," she said. "Go to sleep." He did. Within minutes, his breathing had deepened and slowed into the heavy, untroubled rhythm of a man who believed his secrets were still where he'd left them, and Petunia lay beside him in the dark and thought, not for very much longer. The Hogwarts letter came on a Tuesday morning in April, which was earlier than she'd expected. She was the one who collected the post. She always collected the post. She heard the owl, the particular soft thump of something landing on the hall mat rather than sliding through the slot, and she was in the hall before Dudley came thundering down the stairs with his usual morning appetite for chaos. The envelope was thick cream parchment. The ink was green. In the upper left corner, where a return address should have been, a crest with a badger and a snake and a lion and an eagle, and the words Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry in a typeface that probably had a name that she would never know. She stood in the hall with it in her hands and took one breath, then another. Then she tucked it under her arm and went to make breakfast. Vernon came down at 7:45, took one look at the envelope on the table beside Harry's plate, and went the color of uncooked pastry. Harry was looking at it. He hadn't touched it yet. He was looking at it with an expression that she couldn't quite read, not excitement, not fear, something more contained than either, as if he was being very careful about how much he let himself feel something that might be taken away. "Is that?" Vernon started. "Sit down, Vernon," Petunia said. She poured his tea and set it in front of him with more precision than the action required. "Dudley, go and watch television." "But I haven't had my, Dudley." She looked at him. He went. Vernon sat. He looked at the letter, then at Petunia, then at the letter again. His color had gone from pastry to something ruddier, the embarrassed red of a man who had been caught out, starting to build toward the defensive red of a man about to bluster his way through it. She didn't give him the chance. "I found the letters," she said. The red drained right back out. "Petunia, not now," she said. She was not angry, or rather, the anger was there but it was a tool, not a fire. She had it completely in hand. "Harry, open your letter please." Harry opened it. He read it once, his eyes moving fast down the page. Then he looked up at her, and she saw the question in his face, "Is this real, am I actually allowed to want this?" And she felt a sharp, unexpected pain low in her chest that she identified, with some surprise, as guilt. "You're going," she said. The look on his face was worth every difficult thing that was coming. "Right then," Harry said, and he read the letter again and this time something in his expression loosened, something she had never seen loose before, and he looked 11 years old, briefly, completely, in a way she realized he almost never did. "We have a meeting at Gringotts next week," she told him. "Before you go to Diagon Alley for your supplies. Before anything else. There are things that need to be dealt with first." "With the Goblin Advocate," he said. "Yes." Vernon made a sound. Not quite a word. She looked at him and he met her eyes and she thought she saw, in the complicated depths of Vernon Dursley's face, the particular expression of a man who has been carrying a secret for so long that the relief of being discovered has gotten almost indistinguishable from the fear of it. "We'll talk," she told him. "Tonight. After Dudley's in bed." "Petunia, tonight, Vernon." She stood, collected the breakfast things with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had been running this household for 20 years. "Right now, our nephew just got his Hogwarts letter and I have a legal pad to update." Harry was still holding the letter. She could see him reading it again, the third time, and she thought about Lily, at 11, reading her own letter with that same vertiginous mixture of wonder and disbelief. She thought about how Lily had run to her first. Before Mum, before Dad, she'd come tearing across the upstairs landing and flung the door open and there had been 6 seconds, 6, Petunia had counted them many times since, of pure uncomplicated joy between them before everything else got in the way. She pushed the thought back where it belonged and picked up her legal pad from the counter and wrote 2 new items at the bottom of the 3rd page. Confirm, did Dumbledore know about Vernon's registration? Timeline, when exactly were the blood wards placed? Before or after we married? Aunt Petunia, Harry said. She turned. He was looking at her with those eyes. Lily's eyes, in his terrible second-hand clothes and his cracked glasses and his permanent expression of careful watchfulness. "Thank you," he said. I don't know. For this." She did not let herself be sentimental about it. I should have done it sooner, she said, which was entirely true and was, she thought, approximately the shape of an apology, even if it was not the architecture of one. Now eat your breakfast. You'll need energy. He looked like he might say something else. Then he looked back at the letter, and the ghost of something crossed his face: relief, anticipation, the very earliest cellular structure of hope, and he picked up his fork. Petunia Dursley looked at her legal pad and thought, Dumbledore has no idea what's coming. She was probably right about that. She wrote a third item. Find out what else we were never told. Outside, a Tuesday morning proceeded in its ordinary Muggle fashion: cars passing, a dog barking somewhere on the next street, the smell of cut grass drifting in through the kitchen window. Inside number 4 Privet Drive, the careful, quiet woman who had spent her entire adult life being underestimated sat at her kitchen table, drank her tea, and planned a war. Chapter 2, The Bank That Bites Back. The leaky cauldron smelled like wood smoke and something faintly alchemical, and Petunia walked through it with her chin up and her handbag clutched, not from nervousness but from the specific awareness that she was carrying documents worth more than anything else in the room. Harry walked beside her. He hadn't said much on the train from Surrey, just watched London slide past the window with that focused stillness of his, the Hogwarts letter folded in his jacket pocket in a way that suggested he'd been taking it out and reading it at intervals since Tuesday. She hadn't asked him to stop. She understood the impulse. She had dressed carefully this morning. Not Muggle formally, she wasn't trying to perform Muggle respectability for anyone, but in the dark green coat she kept for serious occasions and the good shoes, and she had put her hair up and worn the pearl earrings that had been her mother's. It was armor as much as clothing. She had learned very early that the way you walked into a room determined the first 30 seconds of any negotiation, and first impressions in a strange world were worth planning for. The barman, Tom, she assumed, she'd read about Tom, looked at her with the particular expression of someone trying to place a face and failing. She gave him nothing to work with. Gringotts, she said, through the back, yes? Yes, missus. The wall, I know about the wall, she said, and steered Harry toward the back courtyard. Harry tapped the bricks with the sequence she'd written out for him from Millicent's briefing notes, and the archway unfolded itself, and the white stone buildings of Diagon Alley stretched out in the morning light. Harry stopped walking for a moment, just stood there with his mouth slightly open, and Petunia let him have it. The first time you walked into somewhere that shouldn't be real but was, she imagined that deserved a moment. It's enormous, he said. It gets more complicated the further in you go, she said, which was what Millicent had told her, and she was fairly sure it applied to more than the geography. They walked the length of the alley with people flowing around them, witches in robes, a wizard carrying an enormous birdcage, 2 children shrieking about something in a shop window displaying broomsticks, and Harry's head turned in every direction at once, and Petunia kept her eyes on the white building at the end that rose above everything else like a small, imperious mountain. Gringotts. She had read about it extensively, but reading about something and standing at the bottom of its white marble steps while armored goblins watched you with the attentive look of people who found most visitors wanting were not the same experience. The goblins were shorter than she'd expected and their expressions were not unfriendly so much as professionally comprehensive. They looked at her the way a very good barrister might look at a new client, evaluating, reserving judgment, deciding whether the matter was interesting. Deep breath, she told Harry, more for herself than him. I'm fine, he said. He looked it. He also looked like a child who just discovered the world was larger and stranger than anyone had told him, which was accurate, and it made something ache. They went up the steps. Inside, the great hall of Gringotts was all chandeliers and marble and the sound of quills scratching across parchment in 100 places at once. Goblins moved with crisp efficiency behind the long counter, and the air had a particular quality, weight, Petunia thought, the specific gravity of a room where enormous amounts of value changed hands daily. She liked it. It reminded her of the feeling of a well-ordered kitchen. She approached the nearest counter. The goblin looked up with the patient expression of someone who had seen everything. I have an appointment, she said. Petunia Dursley, with Ragnarok III, Advocate. 10:30. The goblin's expression shifted in a way that was difficult to read, not surprise exactly, more a particular form of attention that suggested she had said something of note. Name only, no vault business? Correct. Legal consultation. The goblin looked at Harry. And the child? Harry Potter, Petunia said. He's with me. The change that moved through the great hall at those two words was subtle and immediate. It wasn't dramatic, nobody gasped, no chandeliers swayed, but three goblins at nearby counters looked up, and the one she was speaking to straightened fractionally, and there was the particular quality of an intake of breath through a room that has suddenly become more interested. One moment, the goblin said, and disappeared. Harry leaned close to her. They know who I am, he said quietly. Everyone knows who you are, she said. It's one of the things we're going to discuss. A different goblin appeared, older, wearing a coat that was rather better than the others, with a silver chain across the front and an expression that combined professional courtesy with what Petunia was fairly sure was genuine interest. Mrs. Dursley, he said. I am Sharpclaw. I will take you to Advocate Ragnarok. Please follow me. They were led not to a consultation room but down. A door behind the main counter, then a corridor that sloped gently downward, the marble giving way to dark stone, the chandelier light giving way to something that burned blue-white in brackets along the walls. Harry's eyes were wide. Petunia kept pace with the goblin. This is unusual, she said, conversationally. Advocate Ragnarok prefers to meet in chambers, Sharpclaw said. He finds the upper rooms noisy. Reasonable, Petunia said. Harry, just behind her, whispered, there are doors with claw marks on them. Those will be the vaults, she said. The scratches, probably attempts to open them without authorization, Sharpclaw said pleasantly, without turning around. Unsuccessful attempts. Harry didn't say anything else about the doors. Ragnarok III was very old and very small and had the kind of stillness that belongs to things that have been in one place for long enough to become part of it. He was seated behind a desk made from some dark wood that Petunia couldn't identify, and the desk was covered in documents in an arrangement that looked chaotic and was almost certainly precise. He wore half-moon spectacles that were notably similar to Dumbledore's, which she thought was either coincidence or a commentary. He looked at Petunia for 3 full seconds. Then he looked at Harry for 3 more. Then he looked back at Petunia. Sit down, he said. His voice was dry and precise, like the sound of a very old page turning. You brought the boy. I brought my nephew, she said, settling her coat and opening her handbag. He has as much standing in this matter as I do. More, arguably. Arguably, Ragnarok agreed, with the tone of someone who found the qualifier amusing. He looked at Harry again. Mr. Potter. You are aware of your vault here? Harry blinked. I have a vault? Ragnarok looked at Petunia with an expression that said, very clearly, well, that's interesting. You have never been informed about your vault. Nobody's told me much of anything, Harry said, and there was no self-pity in it, just the flat observational quality that she'd noticed was his default. He stated it like a weather report. Ragnarok made a sound that might have been a growl and might have been something else. He opened a drawer, removed a folder, set it beside the papers already on his desk. We will return to the vault question, he said. For now. He turned his attention fully to Petunia and held out one hand. Your documents. She placed them on the desk in order, the ministry letters she'd taken from Vernon's hiding place, her own written summary and analysis, the notes from her meeting with Millicent Hobb, and, on top, because it was the anchor point for everything else, a printout she'd made of the 1612 statute text as she'd found it in a digitized archive of pre-modern British magical legislation that someone had carelessly left accessible through a university server. Ragnarok picked up the ministry letters first. He read them with the rapid efficiency of someone to whom legal documentation was essentially a native language. He set them down. He picked up her analysis. He read more slowly this time, and twice he made a small sound that she decided was approval. He set it all down and looked at her. Your husband declined the 17 provisions 23 years ago, he said. Yes. And obtained no written consent from you, or from the blood-adjacent family members subsequently identified in Notifications 2 and 3. No. Notification 2 being your nephew's mother. Lily Potter, yes. Who was 17 at the time and therefore a minor. And Notification 3 being your nephew himself, at age 0. He looked at Harry with an expression that Petunia was beginning to read as something close to indignation on a very controlled dial. Also a minor, Harry said dryly. Fairly substantially. Ragnar's mouth moved. It might have been a smile. I see you have opinions. I try to have them, yeah. Good. Ragnar turned back to Petunia. The 1612 statute. Tell me what you believe your standing to be. I'll tell you what I know, she said, which she had found was always a better opening than what you believed. The statute predates the Ministry of Magic in its current form. It was drafted in response to the Muggle-born purges of the early 17th century and establishes 17 specific protections for Muggle-born witches and wizards and their non-magical family members. Those protections include, but are not limited to, the right to prior consultation before the placement of magical wards on a Muggle household, the right to information about any ministry decision affecting said household, the right to financial compensation for uninformed use of a civilian magical anchor point, and the right to formal legal standing before the Wisengamot in cases where those provisions have been violated. Ragnar's expression hadn't changed throughout this, but there was something in the quality of his attention that suggested he was no longer in the mode of evaluating whether the matter was interesting and had moved to the mode of evaluating how interesting it was. Dumbledore, he said. Dumbledore, she agreed. You understand what you're doing. Entirely. He looked at her for a long moment. Most witches and wizards are afraid of him. I'm not a witch, Petunia said. And I stopped being afraid of things I didn't understand when I was about 45. I'm 51 now. I've had 6 years to get comfortable with not being afraid. Beside her, Harry made a very small sound that she thought was something between surprise and satisfaction. Ragnar opened another drawer. He removed a document of his own, thick parchment, dense text, a seal at the bottom that she recognized as the Wisengamot crest. Gringotts has had an interest in the 1612 statute for some time, he said, placing it on the desk between them. You are not the first to bring it to our attention. You are, however, the first to arrive with this particular combination of standing. He tapped the stack she'd brought. Blood-adjacent spouse, Muggle-born sibling, and, he looked at Harry, the most politically significant minor in the British wizarding world. I didn't know about any of this, Harry said, looking at the documents. Until a few weeks ago. No, Ragnar said. You wouldn't have. He turned one of his own documents around on the desk so they could read it. It was a Gringotts internal report, and it detailed, in the precise, affectless language of financial documentation, the structure of the Potter family vault, its contents, its management, and the series of disbursements made from it in the years following James and Lily Potter's deaths. Harry leaned forward. He read the figure in the vault's summary and sat back. That's mine? He asked. It has always been yours, Ragnar said. Nobody told me. No. Nobody told you. Ragnar looked at him with an expression that Petunia could only describe as professionally offended. Gringotts has sent 3 notifications to the Potter guardianship over the past decade regarding vault management, mandatory inheritance disclosures, and a blood contract review. All 3 were signed and returned by, he looked at one of his documents, Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, designated guardian representative. The room was very quiet. He signed vault notifications on Harry's behalf, Petunia said. Yes. Without being Harry's legal guardian. He was designated guardian representative, which is not the same as legal guardian. A designation he arranged himself, through the ministry, in the month following the Potters' deaths. A designation that Gringotts was obligated to accept unless contested. He looked at Harry. It was never contested, because the parties withstanding to contest it were not informed it existed. Harry's jaw had tightened. He wasn't looking at the documents now. He was looking at some middle distance with the focused expression that Petunia had come to recognize as him processing something very carefully before he decided how to feel about it. He managed my vault, Harry said. Without telling me. He did not misappropriate funds, Ragnarok said carefully. Gringotts would not have permitted that. But he received all financial disclosures, all legal notifications, all inheritance-related correspondence. Anything the wizarding world wanted Mr. Potter to know went first through Dumbledore. Who filtered it? Petunia said. Who received it? Ragnarok said, with the precise neutrality of someone who would not go further than the documented facts but whose opinion of the arrangement was clear. Harry looked at her. She looked back at him. The air between them had the quality of two people arriving simultaneously at the same understanding and finding it neither surprising nor comfortable. "All right," Harry said quietly. "What do we do?" They were in Ragnarok's chambers for 2 hours and 40 minutes. By the end of the first hour, Ragnarok had explained the full scope of the 1612 statute in a way that made Petunia's own research look like a rough draft, which she accepted without defensiveness because accuracy mattered more than being right. By the end of the second hour, she had 3 new lines of argument she hadn't considered and a list of ministry archive documents she needed to obtain. In the last 40 minutes, they talked about mechanics. "Filing with the Wisengamot is straightforward," Ragnarok said. "They are required to accept a formal petition from anyone with legal standing under an active statute. Your standing is clear. The challenge will be the hearing itself." "Dumbledore will contest," Petunia said. "Dumbledore will do considerably more than contest. He is chief warlock of the Wisengamot, Mrs. Dursley. I know what he is. He will attempt to have the petition classified as frivolous, the statute as void, and your standing as insufficient. He has allies in every significant department of the ministry. He has been building institutional loyalty for 50 years. Ragnarok paused. "He is also, and I do not say this to discourage you, genuinely brilliant. He will see every angle of your case before you present it and he will prepare accordingly." "He hasn't seen me," Petunia said. Ragnarok regarded her. "No," he agreed. "He hasn't." "What's Gringotts' interest in this?" Harry asked. He'd been quiet for some time, listening with that comprehensive stillness, but his eyes had been moving between them and she'd known he was tracking every thread. Ragnarok looked at him with what appeared to be genuine respect. "An excellent question. Gringotts maintains its own legal interests in the 1612 statute. 3 of the 17 provisions pertain to the financial rights of Muggle-born families, including the right to independent vault access and management without ministry oversight. If those provisions are reinstated, it diminishes ministry ability to appoint guardian representatives to vaults belonging to underage magical persons without the consent of their actual family. Which means Dumbledore's designation gets voided," Petunia said. "Among other things." "Yes. And you take over direct management. The vault management returns to its appropriate party." Ragnarok looked at Harry. "To you, when you come of age. Until then, to your designated family representative, if you choose to appoint one." Harry looked at Petunia. She looked at him. "That is entirely your decision," she said. "I'm not assuming anything." "I'd like it to be you," he said. Simply, without ceremony. Just a statement of preference, offered with the kind of trust that she did not think she had particularly earned. She looked at her legal pad. She wrote, "Discuss vault representation with HP, his preference to appoint." Then she looked up. "We'll formalize it properly," she said. "Through Gringotts, not through the ministry." Ragnarok made an approving sound. "Wise. They emerged into the corridor after nearly 3 hours and followed Sharpclaw back up toward the main hall, and Harry was quiet in the way he got quiet when he was carrying something new and still working out its weight. "Are you all right?" she asked. "He managed my money," Harry said. "He received everything, every letter, every notification. The whole time I was at Privet Drive, not knowing anything, he was getting correspondence about my vault and my inheritance rights, and he just filed it away. Or didn't. Did he even read it?" "Probably," she said. "He's a very thorough man." "That's worse," Harry said. "Yes," she said. "It is." They came out through the main hall, past the counters and the quills and the blue-white light warming back into gold, and Sharpclaw paused at the outer door. "Mrs. Dursley," he said. He produced an envelope from inside his coat. "Advocate Ragnarok's initial retainer documentation. The terms are inside. He will require 2 things before filing the petition: certified copies of the ministry correspondence from your husband's registration file. The originals are enough to open the case, but certified copies carry more weight, and a sworn statement from a member of Hogwarts staff confirming the date and nature of the magical wards placed on your household." "A member of Hogwarts staff," Petunia repeated. "The wards were placed under Dumbledore's instruction, but the spellwork was performed by, or at least documented by, a Hogwarts-affiliated party. Gringotts has reason to believe a certain deputy headmistress was present." "McGonagall," Harry said. Sharpclaw said nothing, which was as good as confirmation. "She won't voluntarily testify against Dumbledore," Petunia said. "She may not need to testify voluntarily," Ragnarok said from behind her, and she turned to find he had followed them up silently on his short legs, hands clasped behind his back. "The Wisengamot can compel witness statements. What you need initially is merely confirmation that she has relevant knowledge. A letter. A documented interaction. Something that establishes her as a material witness." He looked at Harry. "Mr. Potter will be attending Hogwarts in September." Harry looked at him. "You want me to, what? Ask her?" "I want you to be attentive," Ragnarok said. "To notice things. You appear to be good at that." Harry considered this for a moment. Then he looked at Petunia with a slightly complicated expression. "Did everyone in this bank just recruit me as some kind of legal spy?" "You're a witness," she said. "Not a spy." "The night Professor Dumbledore brought you to Privet Drive," Ragnarok said, "you were approximately 15 months old. You saw nothing and remember nothing. But there are others who were there and who know exactly what wards were placed and when. The groundwork for this petition was laid the moment Dumbledore put you on that doorstep, Mr. Potter. We are simply building the house." Harry was quiet. "Then, he left me on a doorstep." "In October," Petunia said. "It was cold." "I know. I've been told the story." He looked at her. "You took me in." "There were limited options," she said, which was true and was also not the whole truth, and she thought he probably knew it. They stood in the vast entrance of Gringotts while wizards and witches flowed around them, none of them looking twice at the thin woman in the green coat and the underfed boy with the cracked glasses, and Petunia thought, Dumbledore made a fundamental error the night he left this child on my doorstep without asking. He assumed I would stay the person he had decided I was. He assumed that the sister who wasn't magic would stay small and frightened and contained. He had 30 years of precedent on his side. She would give him that. He did not have the next 30. They had 2 hours before they needed to catch their train, and Petunia had a list she'd prepared of Harry's school supplies. He needed books, robes, a cauldron, equipment. She had checked the current prices using Millicent's referral to a Muggle-friendly currency exchange, and she had also checked the provision in the 1612 statute, Provision 7, specifically, that stated Muggle-born families had the right to claim first-year school supply costs against the Magical Education Fund rather than pay out of pocket, a right that had not been formally communicated to a single Muggle-born family in 50 years because the statute had been buried. She intended to claim it. Not because she needed the money, she had savings, but because claiming it established legal use of a provision that Dumbledore would then have to specifically argue against in the hearing. Every provision she invoked before the petition was filed was one more thread in the web. They went to Flourish and Blots first, because Harry had been eyeing the bookshop window from 50 meters away with an expression of restrained longing that reminded her painfully of Lily. He ran his hands along the spines in the recommended reading section and she watched him pull out the standard book of spells, grade 1, and open it with the careful reverence of someone handling something precious, and she thought, this is where he belongs. In rooms full of knowledge. The thought should not have surprised her as much as it did. She had a word with the shop manager about Provision 7 and the educational fund. The manager looked at her over her glasses. You know about Provision 7. I know about all 17, Petunia said. The manager was quiet for a moment. Then she leaned across the counter and said, very quietly, the fund exists. Dumbledore argued it had insufficient capital for broad enforcement. We stopped asking questions about it in 1971. What year did Dumbledore become Chief Warlock? A pause. 1971, how convenient, Petunia said. The manager looked at her for a long moment. Then she wrote something on a piece of parchment and slid it across the counter. A name and address. If you're going where I think you're going, she said, you'll want to talk to this person. Former ministry archivist. She retired about 5 years ago, but she kept copies of everything. Petunia looked at the name. Filed it. Thank you, she said, and meant it. Harry appeared from the shelves with an armful of books and a look on his face that suggested he'd selected rather more than the first-year list required. Can I? He started. Yes, she said, before he finished. He stared. You don't know what I was going to ask. You were going to ask if you could get additional books beyond the school list. Yes. He looked down at the pile. There might be a history of magic one. And one about Harry. Put them on the counter. He put them on the counter. He looked like someone who had never been told yes to that particular question before, which, she realized with another stab of that complicated guilt, was probably accurate. She had not been good about books. She had been good about practically nothing where he was concerned, but the books in particular. She remembered confiscating 2 library books in the summer of his 6th year because she'd told herself it wasn't safe to encourage it, and the memory sat badly. She paid for the books with Muggle money, invoiced the remainder under Provision 7, and took the receipt. They had an hour left. She bought him a meat pie from a stall in the alley and had a cup of tea herself, and they sat on a bench and she reviewed her legal pad while he read the first pages of the History of Magic book and occasionally said things like, did you know the International Statute of Secrecy was almost broken in 1749 because someone tried to use magic to win a horse race, without looking up, and she made noises of acknowledgement and thought about the network of connections she was building and whether she had everything she needed to file before September. Aunt Petunia, he said. Are you scared? Of any of this? She looked up from the legal pad. He had closed the book and was looking at her with a directness that she appreciated because it did not hedge or soften the question. No, she said. Not even of Dumbledore? Dumbledore is a man who has been operating without meaningful opposition for 50 years, she said. That does things to people. It makes them sloppy in particular ways. They stop checking their assumptions. They stop asking whether the people they've categorized as irrelevant might be paying attention. She paused. I have been paying attention for 30 years. Harry was quiet for a moment. What did he do to you? Personally, I mean. Not just the statute. She considered the question. He decided I was nothing, she said. Not maliciously. That almost makes it worse, actually. He didn't dislike me enough to think about me at all. I was the Muggle sister. A place to store a problem. He gave me a letter about the blood wards, one letter, with no explanation, no consultation, no request for consent, and he assumed I would simply comply because I was not magical and therefore not a person whose compliance required earning. Harry was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "He left me a note," she said, more quietly. "The night he left you. On the doorstep." She paused. "I have it." "What did it say?" "That I should take you in, for your own protection. That the blood wards would keep you safe. That you would be informed of the magical world, when the time came." She folded her hands on the legal pad. "He did not say please. He did not leave a contact. He did not offer any assistance or guidance or acknowledgement that I was being asked to raise my dead sister's child with no warning and no support. He simply left you there and trusted that I would comply." "And you did," Harry said. "I did." She met his eyes. "I have spent 10 years being angrier about how badly I managed that compliance than about the fact that he demanded it. But I am finally angry about both." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Good." Just that. Good. Like he'd been waiting for it. She gathered her legal pad and stood. "We have a train to catch," she said, "and I have a conversation with your uncle tonight that I've been putting off for 2 weeks. Harry stood too, tucking the history book under his arm. He looked younger in the alley light, younger and older simultaneously. There was a quality to him, she thought, that would always read that way, the combination of things he'd been through too early and possibilities he was only now encountering. Is Uncle Vernon going to be all right?" he asked. Not with particular warmth, but not without it either. The careful, qualified version of concern of someone who doesn't have enough data to feel freely. "He's going to have to be," she said, which was not precisely an answer but was the most honest one she had. They walked back through the alley toward the Leaky Cauldron, past the shops and the robes and the Owl Emporium, where Harry slowed and looked with barely concealed longing at a large tawny owl that looked back at him with profound dignity, and Petunia stopped and said, "That's not on the first-year list." "No," he agreed. "But you would like one." "Only if, pick one," she said. "Not that tawny one, it looks insufferably smug. The white one, there." Harry looked at the snowy white owl in the corner cage and his face did the loosening thing again, became temporarily, completely 11 years old, and she turned away to give him the privacy of it and stood in the middle of Diagon Alley with her legal pad and her handbag and her good shoes and thought about everything that was coming and felt, surprisingly, almost entirely unafraid. Behind her, Harry was talking to the owl. The owl appeared to be talking back. Let Dumbledore prepare, she thought. Let him arrange his allies and his arguments and his 50 years of institutional loyalty. She had 17 provisions and a goblin advocate and a boy who had just found out the world was bigger than anyone had told him and was, characteristically, not afraid of it at all. That was going to matter. She already knew it was going to matter enormously. Chapter 3, The Man on the Doorstep. Vernon cried. Petunia had not expected that. She had expected bluster, the particular aggressive reddening that was Vernon's default response to anything that threatened the careful architecture of his life. She had prepared for it, had her documents ready, her tone measured, her argument structured in the order most resistant to being shouted down. She had not prepared for the way he sat across from her at the kitchen table at 10:30 on a Wednesday night with his hands flat on the wood and his face crumpling slowly, like a building whose foundations had finally given way, and cried. He wasn't loud about it. That surprised her too. Vernon was a loud man by nature, large and emphatic in all his emotional expressions. But this was quiet, effortful weeping, the kind that comes from somewhere very old and very deep, and it lasted about 90 seconds and then he wiped his face with the back of his hand and looked at the table and said nothing. Petunia waited. My grandfather, he said eventually. On my mother's side. She told me when I was 8. Said it explained why certain things happened around him that couldn't be explained any other way. He paused. He died before I was born. But it was in the blood, apparently. Just dormant. Not enough to do anything. Just enough to be on their register. Why didn't you tell me? She asked. Because you already had. He stopped. Started again. Lily was magic. Really magic. And you'd spent your whole life being the one who wasn't. Being the ordinary one. He looked up, and his eyes were still wet, but his expression was agonized in a specific, human way. I didn't want to be another person making you feel like the world had left you on the outside of something. Petunia sat with that for a moment. It was, she thought, both one of the kindest things he had ever said to her and one of the most catastrophically wrong-headed decisions of his life, and the coexistence of those two facts was exactly the kind of complicated thing she had never been very good at sitting with. She was better at righteous clarity. But righteous clarity had its limits, and she was 51 years old and did not have the energy to pretend that the man across from her had hidden his secret out of malice when the evidence suggested otherwise. You should have told me, she said. Yes. Whatever your reason, you should have told me. Yes, he said again. Just that. No argument, no defense. Just the exhausted acknowledgement of a man who has known for years what the honest verdict is and has been avoiding the courtroom. There are 2 notifications you signed, she said. Official ministry documents. One for Lily, one for Harry. He went very still. You received official notification that Lily was entering the magical world. And then Harry. And both times you signed the box that said no contact required and you filed them behind the skirting board. I didn't want, he stopped. Lily was all ready, by the time the second letter came, you and Lily weren't, he couldn't find the shape of it. I thought it would hurt you more. To be official about it. To have ministry letters about her. And Harry? Silence. When they sent you the notification about Harry, Petunia said, very steadily, he was a newborn. The notification meant the ministry knew about him, knew about this household, knew about the blood connection. You signed that letter saying no contact required, which meant nobody in the magical world had any official reason to reach out to us. Any rights we might have had, any protections, you declined on our behalf. I didn't know about rights, he said. They sent a form. I signed the form. Did you read it? A pause. Not carefully enough. No, she said. You didn't. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, a car passed. Are you going to leave? He asked. She looked at him. I'm going to fight, she said. That's what I'm going to do. And you are going to help me, because you are the one person who can provide testimony about those notifications, when you received them, what they said, what you signed. You are, as it turns out, the most useful person in this entire situation, because you are documented proof that the ministry's process for handling blood-adjacent families is so inadequate that a man could sign away his family's rights without even understanding that he'd done it. Vernon blinked. You want me to testify? I want you to tell the truth, she said. Which is something you should have done 30 years ago, but which will be considerably more useful now than it would have been then. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him working through it, the lumbering but earnest mental machinery of a man who was not clever in the ways she was clever but who was, at his core, not a coward when the chips were genuinely down. She had married him knowing this about him, had seen it occasionally in their 30 years, and it had never stopped mattering to her. All right, he said. All right, she said. She put the kettle on. The owl arrived 6 days later. Petunia was in the garden when it came, a large, serious-looking barn owl that descended with the confident trajectory of something that had done this many times and didn't need applause for it. It landed on the garden wall, offered its leg, and looked at her with the professional patience of the postal service. The letter it carried was on heavy cream stationery with a purple wax seal that bore a phoenix. She didn't need to open it to know who it was from. She took it inside, set it on the counter, made herself a cup of tea, and then opened it. Dear Mrs. Dursley, I hope this letter finds you well. I understand you have recently visited Gringotts Bank and consulted with certain parties regarding matters of a legal nature. I would be grateful for the opportunity to speak with you directly, at your convenience, and to address any concerns you may have about arrangements I made in good faith 11 years ago. I believe many misunderstandings can be resolved through open conversation. I will be in your area on Friday and would be happy to call at number 4 at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, should that suit. Yours sincerely, Albus Dumbledore. She read it twice. The language was warm and avuncular, the tone of a man who believed absolutely that a face-to-face conversation would resolve things. Who believed that having the conversation was itself a form of management. Who had, in all likelihood, sat down to write this letter entirely certain that whatever the difficult Muggle sister had gotten herself worked up about, a gentle explanation and a steady gaze would sort it out. She thought, "You genuinely don't know who I am." She wrote back, "Dear Professor Dumbledore, Friday at 2 o'clock is convenient. Please come to the front door." Petunia Dursley. She sent it with the owl and then went upstairs and called Harry from his room, where he had been spending most of his time since Diagon Alley, alternating between his new books and long sessions sitting on the bed, appearing to be doing nothing but clearly doing a great deal of internal processing. "Dumbledore's coming Friday," she said. Harry looked up from a history of magic. "Here? To the house?" "Yes. He wants to talk you out of it." "He wants to believe he can," she said. "There's a difference." "How are you with that?" He considered it with the seriousness she'd come to expect. "Fine," he said. "I'd like to meet him, actually." "I'd like you to be there," she said. "If you're willing." "Yeah," he said. "Definitely." She turned to go. He said, "Aunt Petunia." She stopped. "He's not going to be what I expect, is he?" Harry said. "He's not going to be obviously bad." She thought about how to answer that. "He's going to be extraordinary," she said. "Genuinely. He's one of the most remarkable people alive. He's also been wrong about some important things for a very long time and convinced himself that being right about many things means he can't be wrong about the important ones." She paused. "Watch his eyes," she said. "He'll be looking at you the way people look at a piece on a chessboard." "Warmly, but, like a piece," Harry said. "Yes." "Right," Harry said, and went back to his book, and the quality of his stillness had shifted into something else, something more settled, like a person who has been told the rules of a game they already knew they were going to play. Friday arrived grey and damp, which Petunia thought was fitting. She had told Dudley there was a visitor coming and he should stay upstairs, a directive she reinforced with the specific tone that meant there would be consequences for non-compliance. She had told Vernon the same thing, with the addition that if Dumbledore directed anything at him, he should say only that he would prefer to speak with solicitors present, nothing more, nothing less. Vernon had practiced this once or twice, frowning with concentration, and she thought he would manage it. At 5 minutes to 2 she made tea. At 2 minutes to 2 she heard the gate, and she did not go to the window because she did not want to be caught looking. The knock at the door was 3 even raps. Not imperious, not hesitant. Measured. She opened the door. He was taller than she'd imagined from Lily's descriptions, though she wasn't sure why that surprised her. Tall and lean and very old, with a long silver beard and half-moon spectacles and robes that were, she noted, a rather subdued blue rather than anything flamboyant. He had dressed for a Muggle neighborhood, made an effort to be unobtrusive, which she filed away as information. He had silver hair and extraordinary blue eyes that did exactly what she'd told Harry they would do, took her in, assessed her, and offered her warmth that contained within it a very deep confidence in his own ability to manage the situation. It was a masterful expression. She had seen it on barristers. "Mrs. Dursley," he said, and his voice was what she expected, deep and warm and carrying that quality of absolute authority worn so long it had become invisible. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." "Come in," she said, and stepped back, and he stepped into number 4 Privet Drive for the second time in his life. He looked around the hallway. The house was tidy and ordinary and offered him nothing. She had made sure of that, had removed the legal pad from the kitchen counter, had positioned herself so that she would be watching him rather than the other way around. He glanced at the family photos on the wall, the Dursleys in Majorca, Dudley through the years, conspicuously absent of any pictures of Harry, and she saw the micro-expression that crossed his face, a small and well-managed flicker of something that might have been discomfort. Good. She wanted him discomfort. She led him into the sitting room. Harry was already there, sitting in the armchair with his book closed on his knee, and Dumbledore stopped in the doorway. His expression shifted. Not dramatically, he had far too much control for that, but the calibration changed. He had expected to find a Muggle housewife. He had found, instead, the sitting room containing Petunia Dursley and Harry Potter, and something in the arrangement of the scene told him, she could see, that this had been deliberate. That she had staged it. That the boy had been informed and invited and was sitting there with the alert self-possession of someone who knew precisely what he was witnessing. Harry, Dumbledore said, and his voice was warm, genuinely warm, she thought, or at least the decades-old habit of warmth so deeply practiced it had become indistinguishable. I had hoped to see you. Hello, Professor, Harry said. He didn't get up. He looked at Dumbledore with a directness that Petunia thought Dumbledore had not been prepared for, not hostility, just that focused, evaluating calm that was as natural to Harry as breathing. Dumbledore looked at him for a moment that lasted slightly too long. Then he turned to Petunia, who was gesturing to the sofa, and he sat, and she sat opposite him, and she poured the tea with the unhurried efficiency of a woman in complete command of her own kitchen. I imagine, he said, accepting the cup she offered, that you have a great many questions. I have answers, she said. I'm here to discuss what happens next. A small pause. I see. You have been thorough. Yes. Gringotts, he said. Among other sources. He looked at his tea for a moment. When he looked back up, the warmth in his expression had not diminished, but it had deepened in a way that made it more complicated, less a social tool and more a genuine quality. She had the sense of a man engaging rather than performing, which she suspected was how he was most dangerous. Mrs. Dursley, he said. Petunia, if I may. I owe you an apology. She didn't react. She had thought he might try this. The night I left Harry with you, I handled it badly. I left a note when I should have spoken to you directly. I did not explain the blood wards, their nature, or their purpose. I did not consult you as I should have done. I made assumptions about your circumstances and your willingness that were presumptuous and that I have regretted since. And the 17 provisions, she said. The statute is complicated. It isn't, actually, she said. It's quite clear. I've read it several times. The language is straightforward. The provisions are specific. What's complicated is the political history of how it was suppressed, but the statute itself is not complicated at all. He was quiet for a moment. He turned his cup in his hands, a slow movement, and she thought he was genuinely thinking, not performing thought, but actually revising in real time. What is it you want, Petunia? He asked. Gentle. Sincere. The question asked as if he genuinely intended to answer it. Justice is a large word, she said. I'll settle for reinstatement. All 17 provisions, formally restored to active enforcement by Wisengamot order. A formal censure of the process by which they were suppressed. Compensation arrangements for affected families who can demonstrate material harm. And, she paused, a formal review of guardianship designations obtained through the ministry without the knowledge or consent of affected family members. Dumbledore looked at her steadily. Then he looked at Harry. Harry met his gaze without any particular drama, just that flat, clear-eyed steadiness. The guardianship designation, Dumbledore said. You received my nephew's vault correspondence, Petunia said. You received his ministry notifications. You were designated his representative through a process we were not informed of and could not therefore contest. Whether or not that designation was exercised with good intent, it was obtained without consent and it gave you information about Harry that he and I should have received directly. The vault management was not mishandled financially, she said. I know. Gringotts confirmed that. I'm not accusing you of theft. I'm saying the process was wrong and the designation needs to be formally revoked and reissued through proper channels. She paused. Harry has expressed a preference about representation. That preference should be honored. Dumbledore turned to Harry. And what is your preference, my boy? The my boy landed in the room like something placed there deliberately, and Harry looked at it, considered it, and did not pick it up. I'd like things to go through my aunt, Harry said. Officially. Through Gringotts. I see. Dumbledore's voice was still warm but there was something working underneath it now, something that was not quite displeasure but was its neighbor. Harry, I want you to understand that everything I have done has been in service of your safety. I know you think that, Harry said. But you made decisions about my life without asking me or my family, and I was never going to know the difference because all the information came through you. That's the part that bothers me. He paused. Sir, he added, not with deference but with the natural politeness of a boy who had been raised to add it. Dumbledore was quiet. Petunia watched him. She was watching for the thing that happened to powerful people when they encountered a genuinely unexpected response, the momentary fracture in the managed expression, the split second of recalibration. She saw it. It was very brief. You're quite something, he said to Harry, and the warmth was still there but it had changed character. It was realer, she thought, than anything he'd shown yet. Genuine respect, arriving late. Your mother was the same. I know, Harry said. That's one of the things you never told me. The room was very quiet. Dumbledore set his cup down. When he looked at Petunia, the avuncular ease had not disappeared entirely but the architecture beneath it was visible now, and what she saw was something more interesting than a complacent patriarch. It was a man of genuine intelligence sitting with the particular discomfort of someone who has been very sure of something for a very long time and has just been offered the first credible reason to doubt. If I contest the petition, he said. You won't win, she said. Not with aggression. Just accuracy. I am Chief Warlock, of a body that will be voting on a case in which you are named as the primary party responsible for the suppression of the statute in question, she said. Your conflict of interest is substantial. Advocate Ragnarok believes there are grounds to have you recused from the vote, which would remove your ability to manage the outcome. The remaining Wisengamot members will be voting on the merits of a statute that has never been repealed and whose provisions are, on their face, entirely reasonable. The votes are not as solid as you think, she said. I have been doing research, Professor. The families affected by the statute's suppression are not a small group. There are Muggle-born families across Britain who were denied rights they never knew they had. Some of them are Wisengamot members' constituents. Some of them have children currently at Hogwarts. When the specifics of this case become public, and they will become public, because I intend to ensure they do, the political landscape will shift. She met his eyes. I'm not bluffing. I want you to be very clear about that. Dumbledore looked at her for a long time. The blue eyes were very direct, and she had the particular sensation of being seen by someone with extraordinary perceptive ability, not just assessed but read, her motivations and capacities and emotional architecture all being very rapidly processed behind those eyes. She held his gaze and gave him everything to work with because she had nothing to hide. No, he said finally, quietly. You're not bluffing. No, she agreed. And if I cooperate? If I go to the Wisengamot myself and support reinstatement? She had anticipated this too. Then you'll have done something right, and I'll say so publicly. I'm not interested in destroying you, Professor. I'm interested in getting the statute reinstated and making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else's family. She paused. But I'll be honest with you, I don't think you'll do it. Because doing it would mean acknowledging that you were wrong in 1971 and that the wrong caused harm. And you are very good at acknowledging small errors, but the large ones are more difficult, he said. For everyone, she said. But especially for men who have spent 50 years being right about enough things that the alternative has become unthinkable. Silence. Dumbledore looked at Harry again. Harry looked back. There was something happening between them that Petunia didn't fully understand, the beginning of something, she thought, a relationship finding its first footing, not the warm mentor-and-student arrangement Dumbledore had presumably imagined but something more complicated and more honest. "You'll be at Hogwarts in September," Dumbledore said to Harry. "There are things," he paused, "there are things I would very much like to discuss with you, in time." "I expect there are," Harry said. "There are things I'd like to discuss with you too." "Such as?" "My parents," Harry said. "What they were actually like. Not the version that makes the blood wards convenient, but the real version." He held Dumbledore's gaze. "I'd like to know my parents, Professor. You knew them. I think you owe me that much." It was the most he'd said in one stretch, and it landed with a weight that was nothing like the diffidence Dumbledore had come prepared for. Petunia watched Dumbledore's face and saw, quite clearly, a man being asked a question he had not expected to feel. "I did know them," Dumbledore said. "Very well. Then I'll see you in September," Harry said. "And we can start there." Dumbledore left at 3:30. Petunia stood at the front door and watched him go down the path with his unhurried stride, his robes quietly distinctive in the afternoon grey, and she had the feeling, not satisfaction exactly, but something in the same family, of a first engagement that had gone as planned. Not a victory. The hearing hadn't happened. The petition hadn't been filed. There was a great deal left to do. But he had come expecting to manage a frightened Muggle woman and he was leaving knowing that wasn't what she was, and that shift in his understanding was worth something. It would change how he prepared. She needed to know how he prepared. Harry appeared beside her in the doorway. "He's going to fight it," Harry said. "Yes," she said. "But not the way he thought he would. No. He'll be more careful now. More specific." She watched Dumbledore reach the end of the path. "Which means we need to be faster." "The retired archivist," Harry said. He'd been listening at the door, she suspected, for at least part of the meeting. She didn't mind. "The one the bookshop lady told you about." "This week," she said. "Before he thinks to seal those archives." "Can I come?" "I was going to ask if you wanted to," she said. He looked at her sidelong. "You keep doing that." "Doing what?" "Asking. Offering me choices." He said it without accusation, just the observation of someone noticing a new pattern. She looked at the street where Dumbledore had turned the corner and disappeared. "I should have done it years ago," she said. "There's no point cataloguing the delay. We just go forward." He nodded. Then, after a moment, "He was scared of you." She turned to look at him. "He was not scared, not in the obvious way," Harry said. "But when you said the votes weren't as solid as he thought, something moved in his face. He's been in a room where everyone defers to him for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like when someone just doesn't." It surprised him. A pause. "He liked it, actually. I think he liked it." She considered this. "That," she said slowly, "is a very interesting observation." "He's not used to equals," Harry said. "He's surrounded himself with people who either worship him or oppose him for the wrong reasons. You're neither." "You read people well," she said. He shrugged with one shoulder. "You learn to when you've spent your life figuring out which adults in the room are safe." She absorbed that. It deserved more than she could give it right here on the doorstep, and she thought he knew it and was not asking her to address it. He was simply telling the truth, because he had apparently decided, somewhere in the last few weeks, that she was a person he could do that with. She went inside. He followed. The door closed. Vernon came out of the sitting room with the expression of a man who has been listening from behind a door and is trying to look like he wasn't. "Well," he said. "He's going to fight it," Petunia said. "Does that mean?" "It means we file the petition Monday," she said. "And we start preparing testimony." Vernon looked at Harry. Harry looked at Vernon. Between them there was years of bad history and complicated silence, and neither of them moved to resolve it, and Petunia thought, that is a different conversation for a different time. She did not have the emotional bandwidth for everything at once. "Monday," she said again. "Vernon, I need you to write down everything you remember about those notifications. Dates, what the forms looked like, what boxes you checked. Everything." "All right," Vernon said. "Harry, I need you to look at the 3rd chapter of Millicent's brief, she left a copy with me, and tell me if there's anything in the section on material harm that you think applies to your specific situation. You'll know better than I will." Harry nodded. He didn't look daunted by this. He looked, she thought, the way he'd looked in Gringotts, like someone who has just been told that the problem is real and large and that they're the right person to help with it. Like a person who has been waiting for an actual problem to be given, rather than a smaller pretend problem designed to keep them occupied. She went to the kitchen. She put the kettle on. She opened the legal pad to a fresh page and wrote Monday's to-do list in the neat, organized handwriting that she had used for 30 years to keep a house and a family and a private interior life running in parallel, and she thought, "We are not ready yet, but we will be." And beneath the to-do list, in smaller writing, almost like a note to herself, she wrote, "He looked at Harry like he was a piece on a board. Harry was right. That has to change before September." She underlined it. Put the pen down. The kettle boiled. Somewhere upstairs, Harry opened Millicent's brief and began to read. Chapter 4, The Weight of What Was Buried. The Wisengamot convened its emergency session on a Tuesday in late August, 3 weeks before Harry was due at Hogwarts, in a circular chamber deep beneath the Ministry of Magic that smelled of old stone and older decisions. Petunia had been in courtrooms before. She had sat through a planning dispute in 1987 that had lasted 4 days and involved 17 neighbors and a proposed extension that everyone agreed was hideous. She had sat through a small claims matter in 1993 with the kind of patience that came from knowing you were right and simply waiting for the process to confirm it. She was not a woman who was intimidated by formal proceedings. But she walked into the Wisengamot chamber and felt the weight of it, not fear, precisely, but the specific gravity of a room that had been the site of enormous decisions for centuries. The benches rose in a circle, tiered, and they were not empty. 50-odd witches and wizards in plum-colored robes watched her enter with the collective attention of people who had been briefed but not quite prepared. She was not what they had expected. She could see that in the first sweep of the room. They had expected, she thought, a Muggle woman in sensible shoes who would need things explained to her. What she was wearing instead was the dark green coat and her mother's pearls and an expression that suggested she had been doing this for years. Harry walked beside her. He was in the best clothes she'd been able to find him, trousers that actually fit, a proper shirt, the glasses she'd had repaired properly rather than the cracked ones, and he walked the way he always walked, which was quietly and without fanfare and with the total unself-conscious directness of someone who had never learned to make himself small in a room because he'd already tried that and it hadn't worked. Behind them came Ragnarok, which was causing its own effect. The Wisengamot did not often receive goblin advocates. Several members were visibly recalibrating their expectations of the morning. They took their places at the petitioner's table. Ragnarok arranged his documents with the unhurried precision of someone who had prepared so thoroughly that speed was irrelevant. Petunia placed her legal pad, the 4th one now, the first 3 filled cover to cover, flat on the table and folded her hands on top of it and looked at the chamber. Dumbledore was already there. He was seated at the far end of the upper bench in his capacity as chief warlock, which was the position he normally occupied when the Waisengamot sat. He was wearing deep crimson robes and his expression was the measured, grave attentiveness of a man presiding over a serious matter. He had brought 2 advisors. She recognized one of them from her research as Elphia's Doge, a long-standing ally, and the other she didn't know but whose robes carried a ministry insignia that suggested senior department status. Ragnarok had told her, 3 days ago, that there were grounds to have Dumbledore recused from the vote on the grounds of direct conflict of interest. The motion had been filed. Its ruling would come at the start of the session. Dumbledore had not, it turned out, chosen to contest the recusal motion. She had spent an evening thinking about what that meant. "He's letting the hearing happen," Harry had said, when she'd told him. "He's letting the recusal happen," she'd corrected. "Which means he's decided that fighting it would look worse than accepting it. He's managing optics. But he still controls who sits on the bench. He appointed several of them, yes. But he hasn't had a conflict of interest recusal in 30 years. His allies won't know how to vote without his direct guidance. He'll have briefed some of them, but not all. There wasn't time." She'd paused. "He's operating in conditions he doesn't like. That's all we can ask for." Now she sat and watched Dumbledore at the end of his bench and thought, "You came anyway. You could have sent a deputy. You came yourself, which means you want to watch." She did not know yet whether that was an advantage or a complication. Probably both. The session was called to order by the senior undersecretary, a brisk woman named Griselda Marchbanks whom Petunia had read about extensively and who had, according to Millicent, a complicated relationship with Dumbledore's institutional influence and a strong personal commitment to procedural correctness. She was the best possible person to be running the session. Marchbanks read the recusal motion. Confirmed Dumbledore's non-contest. Confirmed that he would remain in the chamber in an observational capacity but would not vote. Then she looked down at the petitioner's table. "Advocate Ragnarok," she said, with a slight lift in her tone of someone who found the goblin's presence mildly extraordinary but intended to give it absolutely no special treatment. "You may proceed." Ragnarok stood. He was, Petunia thought, one of the most effective presences she had ever seen in a formal setting, and this was because he was the complete inverse of what the chamber expected. He was small and old and spoke with the precise, unhurried authority of someone who had been waiting for this particular moment for several decades and was not going to rush it now that it had arrived. "Members of the Waisengamot," he said, "the petition before you is straightforward. The Muggle-born and blood-adjacent protection statute of 1612 is an active piece of magical legislation. It has never been repealed. It has been classified as superseded by subsequent legislation, a classification I intend to demonstrate was procedurally improper and politically motivated, and as a result of that improper classification, 17 legally binding provisions have gone unenforced for 55 years. He paused. We are here to correct that. He began with the statute itself, walking through its history with the particular gift of someone who knew that facts, presented clearly and sequentially, were more devastating than any argument about them. The 1612 statute had been drafted during the purges, he explained, when Muggle-born witches and wizards were being hunted and their families with them. It had been designed as a protection not merely for the magical person but for the entire network of people connected to them, parents, siblings, spouses, households. It recognized, fundamentally, that magic did not arrive in a vacuum. That behind every Muggle-born child who received a Hogwarts letter was a family who had no frame of reference for what was happening and who deserved, at minimum, to be told the truth. Several members of the upper bench were already leaning forward. In 1971, Ragnarok continued, a series of post-war magical governance reforms were passed by this body. Among those reforms was a reclassification of the 1612 statute as superseded by the Magical Education and Welfare Act of 1969. The argument offered at the time was that the 1969 Act covered the relevant educational provisions and made the 1612 statute redundant. He looked up. It does not. The 1969 Act addresses curriculum and institutional standards. It says nothing about the rights of non-magical family members. Nothing about informed consent for the placement of magical wards on civilian households. Nothing about financial protections for Muggle-born families. The two pieces of legislation address entirely different subjects. He paused. A first-year law student would have noted this. The Wisengamot members who voted for the reclassification in 1971 apparently did not. A murmur ran around the upper benches. Or, Ragnarok said, they were not given sufficient time to read the relevant documents before the vote was called. He produced a parchment from the top of his stack. Wisengamot voting records from the 15th of June, 1971. The reclassification motion was introduced on the same day it was voted upon. No copies of the statute were circulated before the session. The motion passed by a margin of 31 to 19, with 7 abstentions. He set the parchment down. 19 members voted against a motion they had been given approximately 40 minutes to consider. Those members were not invited to the subsequent procedural review, at which 3 administrative amendments were made that effectively removed the statute from the active enforcement list. He paused again. Those amendments were made by a 3-person administrative committee, 2 of whom had been appointed to their positions in the 6 months preceding the vote. The murmur had gotten considerably less quiet. Petunia watched the upper benches. She was looking for the people who had been briefed by Dumbledore, trying to identify them by their stillness, the particular stillness of people who were waiting for the argument to arrive at the place they'd been told to push back against. She counted 6 who fit that description. The rest were reacting with the spontaneous attention of people hearing something new. Marchbanks called for order. The documentary record, Ragnarok said, in the restored quiet, demonstrates not incompetence but intent. The statute was not superseded. It was buried. And the practical effect of that burial was that every Muggle-born family in Britain, from 1971 onward, was stripped of 17 legal protections without being told those protections existed, and without being given the opportunity to object. He sat down. Petunia stood up. She had practiced this. Not in front of a mirror, she had always found that artificial, but in her head, going through it at the kitchen table in the early mornings while Vernon slept and Harry read and the house was quiet. She had the legal pad but she didn't look at it. She knew it. I would like to speak briefly about what this looks like in practice, she said. Not the legal mechanics. The people. She had their complete attention. She thought several of them had not been expecting her to be the one to speak, had assumed Ragnarok would carry the whole presentation, that she was a supporting figure. She thought this was useful. My sister was Lily Evans, she said. Later Lily Potter. She received her Hogwarts letter when she was 11 years old. Our parents were Muggle. They didn't know what magic was, or what Hogwarts was, or what it meant for their daughter. They were given minimal information by the Hogwarts representative who came to explain things. They were not told about the 1612 statute. They were not told about Provision 3, which gives Muggle parents the right to a formal consultation period before their child's first term, during which they can ask questions and receive documentation about the educational and social environment their child is entering. She paused. They were not told about Provision 9, which gives Muggle-born families the right to be informed if their child is placed under any form of surveillance or monitoring by the Ministry of Magic during their school years. They were not told about Provision 12, which gives family members the right to nominate a magical liaison, a person with wizarding knowledge who is formally obligated to act as a point of contact for the non-magical family during the child's school years. These things existed. My parents could have had them. Nobody told them. She let that sit. Lily left for Hogwarts and my parents spent 7 years receiving her letters and understanding approximately 1 word in 5, with no one to ask, no formal support, no acknowledgement from the magical world that they existed as anything other than an address to send owls to. She looked at the bench. She looked, deliberately, at the several members she'd identified as Dumbledore's, not with hostility, just with the clear-eyed steadiness of a woman making sure that the people in the room were not going to be allowed to look away. "My nephew is Harry Potter," she said. "His mother was my sister. He came to live with me as a baby. The night he arrived on my doorstep, I was given a note. One note, from Professor Dumbledore, informing me that blood wards had been placed on my home and that Harry would need to remain there until he came of age. I was not asked for consent to the placement of those wards. I was not given any documentation about their nature. I was not told that as a blood-adjacent household member, and I am blood-adjacent, through my sister and through my husband, which I also was not told, I had specific rights regarding the wardship arrangement." She paused. Provision 2 of the 1612 statute requires prior informed consent before the placement of any magical construct on a Muggle household. That consent was not sought. The wards were placed anyway. My nephew lived under those wards for 10 years without either of us understanding what they were or what obligations they created. She turned to the next page of her legal pad, though she still didn't look at it. "I'm not here to argue that the blood wards were malicious," she said. "I'm here to argue that they were unilateral. And that the difference between a protection and a cage is, very often, whether the person inside it was consulted." The chamber was very quiet. She sat down. Ragnarok, beside her, did not look at her, but the quality of his stillness had something approving in it. The ministry's representative was a man called Caractacus Fudge, a cousin, she'd been told, of Cornelius Fudge at the ministry, which was presumably the connection that had gotten him the assignment. He was jowly and nervous and had the prepared manner of someone who had been given talking points and not entirely digested them. He argued that the 1969 Act was comprehensive, that the reclassification had been procedurally sound, and that in any case the statute's provisions were largely symbolic and their reinstatement would create administrative complications. Ragnarok dissected him in 10 minutes. The administrative complications argument was particularly easy. Ragnarok had prepared a 6-page document outlining exactly how each of the 17 provisions could be implemented within the existing ministry infrastructure with specific department assignments and a realistic timeline. He had not come here to win an argument. He had come here to make it impossible for the people in that room to pretend that reinstatement was impractical. Then came the witnesses. The first was Vernon Dursley. He came in through a side door looking precisely as uncomfortable as she'd expected, but he had dressed properly and he had his notes in his hand and he looked, she thought, like a man who had decided that the only way through was straight. He sat in the witness chair, which was a carved thing in the center of the chamber floor that she suspected had enchantments on it, and he looked at her, and she gave him a small nod. Ragnarok asked him, clearly and simply, to describe receiving the ministry notifications. Vernon described them. His voice was steady. He explained that he had received the first notification when Lily Evans had entered the wizarding world, that he had been 19 years old and had understood it to be official correspondence that required his signature and nothing more. He explained that the form had not contained the word rights at any point. He explained that there had been no cover letter, no explanation of what the notification meant or what the implications of his signature were. He explained that the only box on the form was one asking whether he wished to be contacted by ministry representatives, and that he had checked no because the idea of ministry representatives turning up at his parents' home had seemed alarming and inadvisable. "Were you informed," Ragnarok asked, "that by checking that box, you were declining 17 specific legal protections on behalf of blood-adjacent family members?" "I was not," Vernon said. "Were you given a list of those protections?" "No." "Were you told the notification had any legal implications beyond its face content?" "No." "What was your understanding of what you were signing?" "I thought I was signing to say I'd received the letter," Vernon said. "Like a delivery confirmation." Marchbanks, above them, had the expression of someone who had just been shown a particularly clear illustration of a complicated problem. Ragnarok sat down and the ministry's representative stood to cross-examine. He asked Vernon, with increasing frustration, whether he hadn't thought to consult legal counsel before signing a ministry document. Vernon said, with a simplicity that landed harder than any prepared speech. I was 19 years old and it arrived in my post. I didn't know it was magical. It looked like government paperwork. I signed it. The ministry's representative sat down. The second witness was Arabella Figg. Petunia had met her twice, once through Millicent, who had known her professionally, and once at Petunia's kitchen table the previous Wednesday for 3 hours. Arabella was a squib in her mid-60s who had lived on Wisteria Walk for 11 years, which was not a coincidence. She had been placed there by Dumbledore to keep an eye on Harry, a fact she had admitted to Petunia without apparent shame and with the particular tone of a woman who had been doing what she was told for long enough that she had temporarily lost sight of what she thought about it. Then Petunia had explained what she was doing and why, and Arabella had been quiet for a long time, and then she had said, "I knew about the 17 provisions. I never said anything to you because I assumed Dumbledore had." "He hadn't," Petunia had said. "No," Arabella had said. "I suppose he wouldn't have." She was a composed witness. She confirmed the placement arrangement, that she had been asked by Dumbledore to reside near the Dursley household and report on Harry's well-being, that she had done so for a decade, and that at no point had she been instructed to inform either Petunia or Harry about the legal dimensions of the wardship. She confirmed that Dumbledore had been aware of the blood-adjacent classification through her reports, which had mentioned Vernon on multiple occasions. She confirmed that she had written to Dumbledore twice in Harry's early years expressing concern about the boy's living conditions and had been told, both times, that the arrangement was necessary and that Harry's safety was paramount. Did Professor Dumbledore express concern about the conditions Mrs. Dursley was describing? Ragnarok asked. "He said Harry's well-being was being monitored," Arabella said. "That is not what I asked." A pause. "No," she said. "He didn't express specific concern about the conditions. Did he take any action in response to your letters?" "Not that I observed." "But he knew." "He knew," Arabella confirmed, and her voice was tired and clear. Harry, beside Petunia, had gone very still during Arabella's testimony. Not the focused, evaluating stillness. Something quieter and more internal. She didn't look at him directly. She let him have it. When Arabella's testimony concluded, there was a 20-minute recess. Petunia used it to review her closing remarks. Harry got up and walked a short circuit of the antechamber where they waited, not agitated, just moving, the way he sometimes did when he was processing something physical. "She watched out for me," he said, on his second circuit. "She did what she was told," Petunia said. "Those are not the same thing." "No," he agreed. "But she came today." "Yes," Petunia said. "She came today." He stopped moving. He looked at her. "Dumbledore told her not to tell you about the statute. He almost certainly assumed she wouldn't need to be told. That's how institutional suppression works. It doesn't require explicit instruction. It requires everyone in the system to assume that someone else has handled the obligation, and it requires the people with power to never put themselves in a position where they have to confront the gap between what they've told people to assume and what's actually true. Until someone makes them," Harry said. "Until someone makes them," she agreed. He nodded. Then he said, very quietly and not at all dramatically, "Thank you for making them." She looked at him. She thought of Lily at 11, running across the landing with her Hogwarts letter. She thought of the 6 seconds, which she had spent 30-some years wishing she could have back and spend differently. She thought of the note left on a doorstep in October. "It should have been sooner," she said, which was still the shape of an apology. "It's now," he said. "That's enough." They went back in. Petunia called her final witness. Minerva McGonagall entered the chamber with the precise, upright carriage of a woman who has decided that if she is going to do something difficult she is going to do it with complete composure. She was wearing Hogwarts robes and she did not look at Dumbledore as she crossed the floor, which was, Petunia thought, louder than anything she could have said. She had come voluntarily. That had been unexpected. Petunia had sent a carefully worded letter through Millicent asking whether Professor McGonagall would be willing to provide a written statement regarding the night of Harry's placement, prepared to use the Wisengamot's compulsion process if necessary. The reply had come within 4 hours. I will appear in person. I believe I owe it to the boy. No salutation. No signature. Just those 2 sentences in handwriting that was precise enough to be architectural. McGonagall sat in the witness chair. She looked at Marchbanks, then at Ragnarok, then at Petunia, and finally at Harry. Something moved in her face when she looked at Harry: recognition, grief, a feeling that was old and complicated. Harry met her gaze with his usual directness and gave her a small, undemanding nod. She straightened in the chair. Ragnarok walked her through the night of the 1st of November, 1981. She confirmed that she had been present on Privet Drive before Dumbledore arrived. She confirmed that she had observed the Dursley household, including young Harry in the garden under a blanket. She confirmed that she had expressed reservations to Dumbledore about the placement, that she had told him the Dursleys were the worst sort of Muggles, and that he had overridden her concerns. Did Professor Dumbledore consult the resident of number 4 about the placement before leaving Harry? Ragnarok asked. He did not, McGonagall said. He placed Harry on the doorstep. He left a letter. We departed. Did he mention the 1612 statute at any point? A pause. No. Were you aware of the statute's provisions? I was aware the statute existed, she said. I was not aware of its precise provisions. Another pause, and this one had weight in it. I have since read them. And I believe Mrs. Dursley was owed a great deal more than a letter on a doorstep, she said. Her voice was entirely level. I believe I should have pressed harder for that in 1981. I did not. Do you know why you didn't? McGonagall was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands in her lap. Because I trusted Professor Dumbledore's judgment, she said. Because I had trusted it for a very long time and had rarely been wrong to do so, and because on that night I was grieving and exhausted and the simplest available action was to defer. She looked up. That is not an excuse. It's an explanation, and they are different things. Ragnarok sat. He looked at the ministry's representative. Cross-examination? Fudge stood and asked 2 questions and then sat down again. He had the expression of someone who has been given a list of questions that no longer applied to the witness he'd been expecting. Marchbanks called a recess for deliberation. The deliberations took 4 hours. Petunia sat in the antechamber and worked through 2 more pages of her legal pad, not about this case, about the follow-up cases, the framework for compensation applications that would need to be established once the provisions were reinstated. She was already several steps ahead. Harry slept for 40 minutes in the chair beside her with the enviable efficiency of a child who has learned to rest in uncertain conditions, then woke and read his History of Magic book until she quietly asked him what chapter he was on, and he told her, and they talked about it for a while, the International Confederation of Wizards and its political history, and she thought that this was probably the most natural conversation they had ever had, the 2 of them in a ministry antechamber. Waiting for the most important legal decision of both their lives, discussing the political errors of 17th-century warlocks like it was any Tuesday. Ragnarok sat in the corner with his own documents and did not speak unless spoken to. She appreciated this about him. Vernon was not in the antechamber. She'd arranged for him to wait upstairs in a ministry waiting room, which he'd seemed relieved about. She made a mental note to check on him. McGonagall appeared in the antechamber doorway at the 3-hour mark. She looked at Petunia, then at Harry, and then she crossed the room and sat in the chair on Harry's other side and folded her hands on her knee. "How are you finding your summer, Mr. Potter?" she asked. Harry looked at her. "Educational," he said. A small sound that was almost definitely a laugh. "Yes," McGonagall said. "I imagine it has been." "Professor," Petunia said. "Thank you. For coming today. For not waiting to be compelled." McGonagall looked at her with the sharp, steady attention of a woman re-evaluating, not the woman in the chair but the quality of the decision she'd made. "I should have come the moment I received your letter," she said. "I thought about it for 40 minutes before I replied, which was 40 minutes longer than I should have needed." She looked at Harry. "You have your mother's eyes," she said, which was something people said, but she said it like she meant something by it, like she was telling him something about the quality of what Lily had been, not just making a comment about genetics. "I keep hearing that," Harry said. "I'd quite like to see some pictures someday." "I have several," McGonagall said. "When you're settled at Hogwarts, come and see me." Harry looked at her with an expression that was more unguarded than Petunia usually saw from him, something genuinely surprised and pleased and trying not to show how much it meant. "Yeah," he said. "I'd like that." They were called back in at the 4-hour mark. Marchbanks stood at the center of the upper bench. The chamber had the quality of a room that has been having a very thorough argument and has arrived somewhere unexpected. The Wisengamot has deliberated on the petition submitted by Ragnarok III on behalf of Petunia Dursley and Harry Potter regarding the enforcement status of the Muggle-born and blood-adjacent protection statute of 1612, she said. "We have reviewed the documentary evidence submitted, the procedural record of the 1971 reclassification vote, and the testimony of 4 witnesses." Petunia held herself very still. On the question of whether the 1971 reclassification was procedurally proper, the Wisengamot finds that it was not. The 40-minute deliberation period was insufficient. The failure to circulate the relevant statute before the vote constitutes a procedural deficiency. The subsequent administrative amendments were made without the participation of the 19 dissenting members, which is irregular. Marchbanks paused. "The reclassification is therefore void. The 1612 statute is reinstated to active legislation effective immediately." Harry exhaled beside her. She did not. On the question of enforcement of the 17 provisions, the Wisengamot finds that a formal ministry task group is to be established within 30 days to review outstanding cases and establish a framework for compensation applications. The task group will include at minimum 2 Muggle-born or blood-adjacent representatives, one of whom may be nominated by the petitioners. She let herself breathe. On the question of the guardianship designation held by Professor Dumbledore regarding the management of Harry Potter's ministry correspondence and vault notifications, the Wisengamot finds that the designation, while not fraudulently obtained, was obtained through a process that the reinstated statute would have prohibited. The designation is formally revoked. Mr. Potter's affairs will be managed in accordance with arrangements made through Gringotts. Ragnarok, beside her, made the small sound of a man who has won a very specific and important point. Finally, Marchbanks said, and something in her tone shifted, became more careful, more precise. The Wisengamot notes with concern the testimony regarding the conditions of Mr. Potter's wardship and the failure to apply the statute's protections in the arrangement of that wardship. The Wisengamot formally recommends a review of wardship and placement procedures to be incorporated into the task group's mandate. She looked up from the document she'd been reading from. She looked directly at Petunia. "The petition is substantially upheld," she said. The chamber broke into noise. It was not a clean victory. Petunia had known it wouldn't be. There was no formal censure of Dumbledore, Marchbanks had not gone that far, and the votes weren't there for it, and Ragnarok had told her before the session that the censure was a long shot and a second battle. There was no individual compensation order. The compensation framework would take months to build and longer to apply. She had won the principle and the process. The individual remedies would be another day. She sat with all of this in the antechamber afterward, waiting while Ragnarok spoke to Marchbanks's clerk about the task group nomination process. Harry sat beside her with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the middle distance. "It's not done," he said. "No," she said. "The statute being reinstated is the foundation. Now we build the house." "You said that before." Ragnarok said it, actually. "Apparently it's a metaphor I've adopted." He half smiled. Then, Dumbledore. He didn't, Harry paused, working through it. He didn't fight it. He could have done more to fight it. He didn't. She had been thinking about this too. No, she said. Why? Because he's intelligent enough to know when he's been caught being wrong, she said. And because I think, underneath everything else, he does actually believe in the magical world being just. He's made himself its arbiter for so long that he'd confused the two things, but the underlying belief is real. So he let it happen. He let enough of it happen, she said carefully. We won't get the censure easily. He'll protect his own record. But he let the statute be reinstated, which means Muggle-born families going forward will know their rights. That was the most important thing. Harry was quiet for a moment. What about the families who already missed it? 30 years of families. The compensation framework, she said. That's the next fight. We're doing that one too. Did you think we were stopping? He looked at her. Something in his face settled, that quality of decision she'd come to recognize, the internal click of someone committing to a direction. No, he said. I didn't think we were stopping. The door opened. Ragnarok came back in. The task group nomination, he said to Petunia. They will want your recommendation within the week. Millicent Hobb, she said immediately. Ragnarok nodded as if this was precisely correct. The vault designation paperwork is ready for Mr. Potter's signature at Gringotts. When he is settled at Hogwarts and can sign with a witness, we can formalize the representation arrangement. I'll come on the first Hogsmeade weekend, Harry said. You will not be permitted Hogsmeade visits as a first year, Ragnarok said. Then I'll find another way, Harry said, without particular drama, as if this were a minor scheduling issue rather than a rule. Ragnarok looked at him. I see. I'll manage it properly, Harry said. I'm not going to break anything. I'll write to the bank until there's an arrangement. There are provisions, Ragnarok said, for minor vault holders to conduct business through OWL correspondence with a provisional signature protocol until they are of visiting age. He paused. I will send you the relevant forms. Thank you, Harry said. They gathered their things. Petunia put on her coat. Ragnarok departed with Sharpclaw, who had materialized from somewhere as goblins apparently did. McGonagall had left an hour ago with a look on her face that Petunia thought would take some time to resolve into whatever it was going to become. They took the lift up through the Ministry atrium, enormous and gold and full of moving statues that Harry looked at with the mild curiosity of someone who has seen enough extraordinary things today that extraordinary things have stopped being extraordinary, and came out through the telephone box in a London street in the late afternoon. The city was entirely itself. Black cabs and pigeons and the smell of someone frying onions somewhere nearby and grey August sky and the whole vast indifferent machinery of the Muggle world proceeding without any knowledge that the world underneath it had just shifted fractionally but meaningfully toward something more honest. Harry stopped on the pavement and looked up. Just looked at the sky, breathing. All right? She asked. Yeah, he said. Then, she had pictures of my mum. McGonagall. She has pictures and she'll show me. He said it quietly, still looking at the sky. I've never seen a picture of my mum at school. Just the one at home, which is small and, I've looked at it so many times I can't see it properly anymore. Petunia stood beside him on the London pavement. She thought about a photograph she had at home, not framed, not displayed, kept in the back of her bedside table drawer where she hadn't looked at it in years. Lily at 15, laughing at something off camera, her red hair catching the light in a way that the photograph rendered as gold. A summer afternoon in the back garden at Cokeworth. Petunia had taken it. I have photographs too, she said. He looked at her. I should have shown you years ago, she said. I'll show you when we get home. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The look on his face was enough, that look of someone receiving something they'd stopped letting themselves want, opening carefully, the way you open something fragile." She started walking toward the tube station. After a moment he walked beside her. It was not a clean victory. The censure would be another battle. The compensation framework would be months. Dumbledore would rebuild his position and protect his legacy, and the full accounting of what had been done and left undone would take years longer than either of them had. But the statute was reinstated. Harry's affairs were his own. And in 3 weeks he would be on a train to Hogwarts, knowing, for the first time, exactly what kind of world he was entering and exactly what kind of people were in his corner. That was what she had set out to do. It was enough. It was, she thought, walking through London with her nephew beside her and the legal pad in her bag and the photographs waiting at home, more than enough. Chapter 5, The Whispering Campaign. The owl arrived on the 3rd day of term. Harry found it waiting on his bed in the first-year boys' dormitory when he came up from dinner, a sleek ministry bird with official post markings and that particular quality of self-importance that ministry correspondence seemed to cultivate in its carriers. He recognized the ministry seal and felt a brief, specific alertness, not alarm, just the heightened attention that had become his default mode since August. He opened it. It was addressed to him personally, which was already unusual, and the language was careful in the way that things written by people who expected to be read back to them were careful. It informed him that the Wizengamot Task Group on Statute Reinstatement had been formally convened, that Millicent Hobb had been confirmed as Muggle-born representative, and that as a named petitioner Harry was entitled to receive updates on the group's progress. It also informed him, in a paragraph that was written more carefully than any of the others, that a formal review of his wardship had been initiated under the new enforcement framework and that he might be contacted for additional information. He folded it and put it in his trunk and went down to the common room. Gryffindor Common Room at 8 o'clock in the evening had the pleasant chaos of a space where 40 people of varying ages were all doing different things and none of them were particularly worried about any of the same ones. A fire burned in the grate. Older students argued over a chess board. Someone in the corner had a copy of the Daily Prophet folded open to a story Harry had seen the headline of at dinner and had not yet had a chance to read. He crossed the room and looked over the reader's shoulder. The reader, a third-year girl with red hair who introduced herself as Annabelle without looking up, didn't object. The headline read, "Muggle Woman Wins Wizengamot Battle, Ancient Statute Reinstated After 55 Years." The article beneath it was 3 columns and ran to a second page. Harry scanned it quickly. It covered the hearing, which was accurate enough, and the statute's reinstatement, which it described in reasonable detail. Then it reached the section that someone had written with a very specific agenda, because the language changed, became more loaded, more careful in the wrong direction. Sources close to the Wizengamot suggest that the petition, while legally successful, raises significant questions about the institutional knowledge and intentions of some of Britain's most respected magical figures. Chief Warlock Dumbledore, who voluntarily recused himself from the vote, has long been considered the foremost guardian of Muggle-born rights in the magical world, having championed numerous protections for non-pureblood witches and wizards throughout his career. Harry read that twice. The petition was brought by Petunia Dursley, Muggle sister of the late Lily Potter, in what some Wizengamot observers have described as a technically correct but politically motivated challenge. "The statute is real and its reinstatement is warranted," said one anonymous senior ministry official, but one must ask whether this particular legal challenge was the appropriate vehicle for what appears to be a personal grievance. He stopped reading. He stood in the common room firelight with the Daily Prophet in someone else's hands and felt the particular cold clarity of recognizing something he'd been warned about. Not surprised, his aunt had told him it would come. She had told him in the kitchen at Privet Drive, 10 days before term started, while she was writing letters and he was packing books, "He'll move through proxies. He won't attack directly. He'll let other people say the things he can't say himself, and he'll make sure those things are just credible enough to be repeated." He'd asked her what they should do about it. She'd said, "Keep building. Noise is noise. The statute is reinstated. That's a fact. Nobody can make it not a fact." He went up to bed and wrote her a letter. Aunt Petunia, the prophet's running a story. The language in it is interesting. I've read it and I think you should see it. I'm sending the relevant section, which I copied out. The hearing is being described as technically correct but politically motivated by an anonymous ministry official. Dumbledore is being described as a champion of Muggle-born rights, which is technically accurate for some things and strategically timed for this particular moment. Everything here is fine. The classes are manageable and the food is good. I've met some people. I'm being observant in the way Ragnarok mentioned. One thing I think you should know, the wards on the school are old. There are portraits everywhere and some of them talk and some of them listen. I haven't said anything I wouldn't say in front of anyone, but I wanted you to know I'm aware. McGonagall showed me the photographs. Harry he sealed it and attached it to Hedwig, who had arrived at Hogwarts in considerably better spirits than the journey in the crate on the train had suggested she would. She had the manner of an owl who considered herself a professional and took her work seriously, and she looked at the letter with the specific attention of someone reading the address to confirm competence. "Privet Drive," he said. "Petunia Dursley. You know the way." She did. She went. He watched her out the window until the dark swallowed her, and then he got into bed and lay looking at the ceiling of the four-poster and thought about the photographs McGonagall had shown him. There had been 6. Lily at 12 in what was clearly the first week of term, laughing at something off-camera with her uniform slightly crooked. Lily at 15 with James Potter and 2 other boys Harry didn't know, all of them on broomsticks at a ridiculous altitude, looking collectively insane. Lily at 17 in Hogsmeade, red hair bright, mid-sentence. One that McGonagall had paused on, Lily at the staff table at some end-of-year feast, talking to a much younger version of McGonagall herself, both of them earnest about something, notebooks open between them. "She used to come to me with ideas," McGonagall had said, sitting across the desk from him in her office with a cup of tea he hadn't touched because he'd been too absorbed in the photographs. Proposals for improving how the school communicated with Muggle families. She wrote 3 papers about it in her 6th and 7th years. They were extraordinarily good. She'd paused. "I sent them to the relevant ministry department. I was told they would be considered." Another pause. Apparently they were not. Harry had looked at the photograph of his mother at 17, mid-sentence, clearly in the middle of making a point that mattered to her, and had thought, she already knew. She already saw it and was already trying to fix it. He thought about that now, in the dark dormitory, listening to 4 other 11-year-olds breathe in their sleep. His mother had tried. With papers and proposals and the tools she had at 17. She had seen the gap between what the magical world promised and what it actually delivered to people who came from outside it. He was not his mother. He was 11 years old and he was at school and the immediate territory of his life was potions and transfiguration and a castle full of moving staircases that were still doing his head in. But he was also the named petitioner on a Wisengamot case and the holder of a vault he'd just gotten control of and the person Ragnarok had looked at and said, "You are attentive, that will matter." He would stay attentive. Petunia's reply came 4 days later, via Hedwig and also via a second owl that arrived simultaneously carrying what appeared to be an internal Gringotts communication in a sealed gold envelope. He read his aunt's letter first. "Harry, I've seen the prophet piece. I expected it 3 days earlier, which means either someone delayed or the decision to run it took more debate than they'd hoped. Either way, it tells us something. The anonymous ministry official is almost certainly someone in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. The language pattern is consistent with their briefing style, which Millicent recognized immediately. She's noted it. We're not going to respond publicly, which is what they're hoping for. A response would be the story. Our silence makes their story much less interesting very quickly. The compensation framework is moving faster than I anticipated. Millicent has been extraordinary. She has identified 43 families in the first 2 weeks who were affected in ways that are clearly documentable. The task group meets again Thursday. I spoke to Vernon this morning. He's been reading about the wizarding world, which I find I'm not opposed to. He asked questions, which I answered. We're managing. The photographs you mentioned, I'm glad. I've sent you something separately. It should arrive with this letter. Keep being observant. You don't need to report to me, I trust your judgment. But if you see something that bears on the case, write. PDPS. The compensation framework will likely require testimony from current students about whether they were informed of the statute on arrival at Hogwarts. You don't have to do this. But the option exists. He unfolded the something she'd sent separately. It was a photograph, small and slightly worn at the edges, of Lily Evans at what he guessed was about 15 in a garden he recognized immediately as the back garden of Privet Drive. She was laughing at something off camera and her hair was catching the light and everything about her was in motion. On the back, in his aunt's handwriting, Cokeworth, 1971. I took this. He sat on his bed in the morning light and looked at it for a long time. Then he put it in the inside pocket of his school robes where he could feel it. The Gringotts letter was about the signature protocol, the provisional vault correspondence arrangement Ragnarok had mentioned. 3 forms, each requiring his signature and a witnessing signature from a Hogwarts staff member. He read them carefully, which took longer than expected because Gringotts' legal language was to ordinary English what a cathedral was to a garden shed. But the substance was clear. Once signed, he could conduct vault business by owl correspondence without needing to come to the bank in person until his 3rd year. He needed a staff witness. He went to see McGonagall. She was in her office at 8 on a Saturday morning, which Harry had expected because she struck him as a person who kept consistent hours as a matter of principle. She was marking papers with a red quill that moved with the speed of someone who had been doing this for decades and had strong opinions about it. He knocked. She looked up. Mr. Potter. Professor. I have a document that requires a staff witness signature. It's from Gringotts. He crossed the room and put the forms on her desk. She read them. She read them properly, which he appreciated. She wasn't just looking for where to sign, she was actually reading the content, and her expression as she did was that of a woman who was processing several things at once. Your vault correspondence protocol, she said. Yes. The vault designation is newly under my direct management, following the Wisengamot ruling. She set the forms down and looked at him. You've been busy. My aunt has been busy, he said. I've been helpful where I can. A small pause. Sit down, Mr. Potter. He sat. She folded her hands on the desk in the way he'd already come to recognize as the precursor to a real conversation rather than a procedural one. The Daily Prophet piece, she said. I've seen it. Have you discussed it with your aunt? Yes. And? We're not responding publicly, he said. It would make the story more interesting. We're letting it die. McGonagall looked at him with an expression he was beginning to understand as approval being administered in careful doses. That's the correct decision. I thought so. He paused. The piece is working, though. I've had 3 separate conversations in the last 4 days where people said something about the case and used the words personal grievance. The phrase from the article, she said. Exactly. People heard it once, in print, with the implicit authority of the prophet behind it, and now it's the frame they're using. He looked at his hands. My aunt said he'd do it through proxies. She was right. She usually will be, McGonagall said, and there was something in her voice, not bitterness, but the complicated acknowledgement of a woman who has been on the wrong side of Petunia's accuracy and is working out how to hold that. Professor, Harry said. Can I ask you something? You may. Dumbledore. In 1971. Did he understand what he was doing? When the statute was suppressed? The question sat between them. McGonagall looked at it. Then she looked at Harry with the directness that was her most consistent quality. Yes, she said. I believe he understood. Then why? Because he was managing a war, she said. The First War, Voldemort was rising and the magical world was fracturing and Dumbledore was trying to hold it together with very limited resources and a great deal of terror. The statute represented an obligation to engage with the Muggle world in a systematic way at a moment when he needed to keep the magical world sealed and focused. She paused. I'm not defending it. I'm explaining the thinking. He decided that the protections could wait and that people could be kept safe through other means, his means, specifically, and he was wrong, and the cost of his being wrong was paid by people who never knew they were paying it. Like my mother, Harry said. Like your mother, she agreed. And you. And your aunt. He looked at the photograph in his pocket, he could feel its edge against his ribs. The papers my mother wrote. The proposals about Muggle family communication. What happened to them? McGonagall was very still for a moment. Who told you about those? You did, he said. You said you sent them to the relevant ministry department. I didn't say what happened to them. No, he said. What did happen to them? She looked at her desk. Then she opened a drawer and produced a folder, not ministry sealed, not official, just a manila folder of the sort that existed in both Muggle and magical offices as a gesture toward organization. She put it on the desk between them. I kept copies, she said. He looked at the folder. She was 17, McGonagall said. She wrote 3 papers and they were exceptional and I sent them to the ministry and I heard nothing, and I told myself that was how bureaucracies worked, and then Lily went off and married James and then she died and I put the copies in that drawer and closed it. Her voice was level. It's been open once in 10 years. I should have done something with them before now. I know someone who might want to read them, Harry said. Your aunt, McGonagall said. She's building the compensation framework, Harry said. She's building it from scratch, trying to document every way the statute's suppression caused harm and establish precedent for remedies. My mother identified those harms 20 years ago and wrote about them and proposed solutions. He looked up. That's not just evidence. That's a history, McGonagall said. Yes. She pushed the folder across the desk. Take them, she said. Send them to her. Tell her, she stopped. Started again. Tell her that the ministry official who received them in 1979 was in Dumbledore's department. Harry picked up the folder. You're sure? I've been sure for 45 years, she said. I've been waiting to be sure it was the right moment to say it. He put the folder in his bag. He looked at her. Is it the right moment? Yes, she said. I rather think it is. He signed the vault forms. She witnessed them. He got up to leave and she said, without looking up from the forms, your mother would be appalled and proud in approximately equal measure. He turned in the doorway. Which one's louder? She looked up. The expression on her face was one he would remember for a long time. Proud, she said. By quite a margin. The whispering campaign gathered momentum through October. It was not obvious, that was the thing about it, the thing that made it difficult to address directly. Nobody said anything outright. No one in the Daily Prophet ran a second piece attacking the petition or the Dursleys by name. It was subtler than that. It was the way a conversation in the Gryffindor common room would drift toward how unusual it was for a Muggle to challenge the Wisengamot. It was the way a certain kind of student, usually the ones with old family connections, would mention Dumbledore's decades of service in a specific tone that invited a particular inference. It was the way the story in the Prophet was still being cited, 2 weeks on, in contexts where someone was trying to add a cautionary note to any discussion of the statute. Harry watched it. He tracked it with the focused attentiveness of someone who has been told to notice things and has discovered a talent for it. He didn't engage. He answered direct questions with direct answers, he corrected factual inaccuracies without heat, and he let everything else pass because his aunt had told him that responding to every probe was exhausting and counterproductive and that the best response to a whispering campaign was to be consistently, visibly fine. He was fine. He was, genuinely, fine. He had classes he liked, Transfiguration was extraordinary, Charms was satisfying, History of Magic was less boring than Binns made it because Harry had Lily's papers to compare against and the gap between what was recorded and what had actually happened was genuinely fascinating. He had Hedwig, who remained the most competent correspondent he'd ever had. He had an owl exchange with Ragnarok ongoing about the Provisional Correspondence Protocol, which was educational in ways that had nothing to do with Hogwarts curriculum. And he had a small, worn photograph in his breast pocket and the knowledge that the folder he'd sent to Privet Drive had arrived there and been received with what Petunia's reply had described as significant interest. What he didn't have, entirely, was people. Not that he was lonely, the dormitory was companionable and the classes were full and there was a red-haired boy named Ron Weasley who sat next to him in History of Magic and had strong opinions about both Quidditch and wizard chess and talked enough for two people. But there was a particular quality to how people related to him that had shifted since the start of term, and it had gotten subtler and more complicated since the Prophet piece. Some people were curious about the case in the way of people who found legal drama entertaining. Some people were uncomfortable about it in a way that expressed itself as a kind of performative deference. A few, the old family ones, mostly, had a careful distance about them that said they were watching to see which way this went before committing. Only a handful seemed to take no particular position and just treat him like a person. Ron was one. Hermione Granger, who sat in the front of every class and read everything including the books they hadn't been assigned yet, was another. She had asked him 3 pointed questions about the statute in the first week and then gone off and apparently read it herself, because she'd come back 2 days later with a list of observations that were so well-reasoned he'd sent 3 of them to his aunt. He was in the library with Hermione on a Thursday evening when he heard the name. He wasn't eavesdropping. He was reading a charms theory text that was dull enough that his attention had drifted, and 2 fifth-years were talking 2 tables over in the insufficient murmur of people who think they're being quiet. One of them said something about the case. The other said Dumbledore's name. Then the first one said, in a tone of absolute social certainty, well, Dumbledore's always done what's right. It's just odd that a Muggle would, I mean, she can't really understand the political complexity, can she? Harry put down the charms text. Hermione, beside him, had stopped reading too. She looked at Harry. He looked at her. She had the expression of someone who has just assessed a situation and is waiting to see what he does. He picked the charms text back up. Hermione said nothing for a full 30 seconds. Then, very quietly, that was from the article. Yes, he said. The language. Political complexity. It was in the article. Yes. Which means it's working, she said. As a strategy. People are using language from a single article as if it's their own analysis. Yes, he said. That's actually quite clever, she said, with the honest intellectual appreciation of someone who could admire a mechanism even while disapproving of what it was doing. She said he was intelligent, Harry said. I believed her. Hermione looked at her book, then back at him. What's the counter-strategy? Keep building, he said. The compensation framework. The task group. Real work that produces real outcomes. The statute being reinstated means families get actual protections now, actual rights that they can actually use. That's not a political story. That's a real thing that happens to real people and it will accumulate over time until the noise is just noise. She considered this. Long game, she said. Yes. That requires patience. My aunt has remarkable patience, he said. I'm learning it. Hermione looked at him with the kind of assessment that he was getting used to from the people in his life who were paying actual attention. She must be extraordinary, she said. She is, he said. And then, Because it was true and because he was in a library 2 months into his first term at Hogwarts with a photograph of his mother in his pocket and a real sense, for the first time, of having people he could say true things to. She wasn't, before. Or she was, but she didn't use it. She was, smaller, somehow. More afraid. I don't know exactly what changed. You know what changed, Hermione said, without unkindness, just accuracy. He did. The letters behind the skirting board. The legal pad filling up. The quiet Tuesday morning in April when she'd come out to the garden and sat on the step beside him and said your Hogwarts letter will likely arrive in the next few months, and everything had shifted in a way that was still shifting. Yeah, he said. I know. The second piece in the Daily Prophet came the following Monday. It was worse than the first one. It didn't attack Petunia directly, it was still operating in the register of concerned analysis and anonymous sources, but the framing was tighter and the implication clearer. A senior Wisengamot member was quoted by name saying that the reinstatement, while technically correct, had been rushed through without sufficient examination of the administrative burden it created. There was a sidebar about the compensation framework that described it as potentially destabilizing for ministry finances. And at the end, half hidden in the last paragraph in the way of something placed to be noticed by people who were looking for it, was a comment about the petitioners. It is worth noting that Harry Potter, whose name appears on the petition, was approached for comment and did not respond. Sources suggest the boy may not fully understand the legal and political implications of the case bearing his name, and that greater care might have been taken to ensure his interests were properly represented before the petition was filed. Harry read this at breakfast. He put the prophet down. He drank his orange juice. He considered the comment with the focused calm of someone who has read enough legal documents in the last 4 months to recognize a specific rhetorical tactic. They were trying to separate him from his aunt. Suggesting he'd been used, or misled, or was too young to have chosen this. Trying to introduce doubt about whether the case was being run in his interests. It was, he thought, the first genuinely clever move they'd made. Because the age angle was real, he was 11, and there were people who would find the idea of an 11-year-old petitioner uncomfortable regardless of the substance, and coupling that discomfort with the suggestion that he hadn't understood what he was signing onto was the sort of thing that burrowed in and was hard to address without sounding defensive. He thought about what his aunt would do. Then he went to McGonagall's office after breakfast. She was there. She looked at the piece when he put it on her desk. She read the last paragraph twice. They're trying to argue I was used, Harry said. Yes, she said. I wasn't. I know you weren't. I made a choice, he said. In April. In the garden at Privet Drive, before the Hogwarts letter came, before any of the legal work had started. She told me what she'd found and what she was planning, and she told me to follow her lead, and I said I would if she explained things as we went. She did. I understood every step. He looked at McGonagall steadily. I need to say that publicly. That would require a statement, she said. Yes. To the prophet. To someone, he said. Not the prophet necessarily. They'll frame it however it suits them. But there should be something on record that says I was a willing and informed participant. Something that can be cited. McGonagall was quiet for a moment. Then, a formal witness statement to the task group, she said slowly. Not a press statement. Something with legal standing. You mentioned your aunt's letter about testimony from current students. Provision 4 of the statute, he said. Current students can submit testimony about whether they were informed of the statute's provisions on arrival at Hogwarts. That testimony is to be submitted to the task group as part of the compensation framework assessment. You want to submit yours. I want to submit it in a form that also addresses the question of my participation in the petition, he said. 2 purposes, 1 document. It becomes part of the official record, which means when someone cites the prophet piece, there's a formal counter-document. She looked at him the way she'd been looking at him since September, that recalibrating look, the one that was still adjusting to what he actually was rather than what she'd expected. "Your mother would have done exactly this," she said. "She had the same instinct, turn the procedure against the attack." "Were you ever going to stop comparing me to her?" he asked. "No," she said, without hesitation. "I find it instructive." "Is that bothersome?" "Not even slightly," he said. She pulled out a sheet of parchment. "Let's draft it together," she said. "You speak, I'll note the points, and then you write the formal version. That way it's entirely yours." He sat down. He started talking. He said, "My name is on the petition because I chose to put it there." He said, "I was told everything at every stage." He said, "I read Millicent Hobbs' brief in April, at the age of 10, and I understood it, and I signed on." He said, "I was not a passive recipient of this case, I was a participant, and the suggestion that I require rescue from my own decision is both factually wrong and the sort of reasoning that got the statute buried in 1971. That last line was good. McGonagall wrote it down and underlined it. He looked at it. "Is that too much?" "No," she said. "Keep it." He sent the draft to Petunia before he finalized it. Her reply came in 36 hours and said, "This is exactly right. File it. The last line is particularly good. Keep the last line." Millicent Hobb, copied in, added, "We will incorporate this into the task group's record. It will be cited." "Well done." Ragnarok's note was characteristically brief, filed. "The counter-document will be available to the press by end of week. The Prophet will not run a third piece this month." He was right. They didn't. The whispering didn't stop entirely, but it changed in character, became less coordinated, more the organic background noise of people who had received a signal and were still processing it. Harry tracked it less carefully now, because the formal record was established and the task group was working and the compensation framework was building itself week by week in ways that had nothing to do with him personally. He had a November. He flew for the first time on a broomstick in a charms practical and was startled to discover that he was, apparently, naturally very good at it. The broom responded to him before he'd finished the thought, and the ground dropped away, and he stayed at altitude looking at the castle for 30 seconds while everyone else was still wobbling at 6 feet. McGonagall, watching from the courtyard, looked at him with an expression he couldn't read from altitude. He came back down. He wrote long letters to Petunia about Hogwarts, not just case updates but actual accounts of classes, of the castle's more eccentric architectural decisions, of the fact that the moving staircases had an internal logic he was beginning to understand. She wrote back with the same thorough attention she gave everything, asking questions about things he'd mentioned and occasionally making observations that were sharper than anything in the history of magic curriculum. He had dinner once a week, by arrangement, with McGonagall. They talked about everything, the statue reinstatement, Lily's papers, transfiguration theory, the castle's history, what the magical world looked like when you paid attention to its institutional failures rather than its wonders. He found that talking to McGonagall was like having access to 40 years of institutional memory that was finally willing to be honestly accessed. She knew where all the bodies were. She was deciding, with the visible deliberation of someone who had been deferred for too long, to stop protecting them. He received a letter from Ragnarok in mid-November that made him sit down carefully. "Mr. Potter, the task group has completed its initial census. 47 families have been formally documented as having suffered material harm through the statute's suppression. The total figure is projected to reach substantially higher when the full census is complete. In reviewing the records related to your particular case, the task group has identified a document that you should be aware of. It is a ministry internal memo from November 1981, signed by the designated Guardian representative, regarding the placement arrangement at Privet Drive. The memo describes the arrangement in terms of efficiency and necessity and recommends that the Muggle household not be informed of the full scope of their obligations or rights. We are recommending formal publication of this memo as part of the compensation framework evidence base. We wanted you to be the first to know. Ragnarok. Harry sat in the Gryffindor common room with the letter and felt something that was not quite anger and not quite grief and was something in the specific territory between them, the particular emotional register of finding out that something you half suspected was completely true and documented and provable. He wrote to his aunt. He told her about the memo. He told her about the task group's numbers. He told her about Lily's papers and the ministry official who'd buried them, which she'd already known from the copies but hadn't yet confirmed the official's connection to Dumbledore's department. At the bottom of the letter, he wrote, "We are going to win this. Not the way today's newspapers measure winning. The way things that are true always eventually become impossible to ignore." She replied 3 days later. Harry. The compensation framework passed its first stage review yesterday. 11 families will receive formal acknowledgement before Christmas. The draft language for standard Muggle-born arrival information, incorporating all 17 provisions, is with the task group. Millicent thinks it will be adopted by the start of next year. Your mother's papers have been formally entered into the record. Her proposals will be cited in the revised guidelines. Lily Evans identified this problem 20 years ago. The magical world didn't listen. Now it will. PD. He folded the letter. He put it in his trunk with the others, in the folder he'd labeled simply PD, which was getting thick and would need a second folder soon. He went down to dinner. Ron was already there with his chessboard and Hermione had a stack of books and the fire in the Great Hall was going and the castle was enormous and full of things he was only beginning to understand, and he was 11 years old. And he was fine. He was, genuinely, more than fine. He had people. He had work. He had a photograph in his breast pocket and a goblin advocate who sent him letter updates and a former ministry archivist with copies of everything and a professor who had 40 years of institutional memory and had decided to stop protecting the wrong things. He had an aunt who had spent 30 years being underestimated and had turned it into the sharpest possible tool. The whispering campaign would run its course. The prophet would run its pieces and the anonymous ministry officials would make their careful comments and the old family students would keep their careful distances. The task group would keep building. The statute was reinstated. Lily Evans's papers were on the record. None of that was noise. All of that was permanent. He picked up his fork and ate his dinner and thought about what Chapter 6 of A History of Magic got wrong about the International Confederation's founding, and outside the enormous windows of Hogwarts the Scottish autumn did its usual dramatic business, and the world was imperfect and complicated and actively getting better, and that was, he thought, exactly enough. Chapter 6, What We Build After the Second Wisengamot session was scheduled for the 23rd of December, which Petunia thought was either a coincidence or a deliberate choice by someone who assumed that scheduling a legal proceeding 2 days before Christmas would reduce attendance and enthusiasm. She had attended every task group meeting since October. She had read every document the group produced before the next meeting. She had filed 3 supplementary briefs and corresponded with Ragnarok on an almost daily basis and eaten more meals at her kitchen table reading ministry documents than she had eaten with her family, which was something she intended to correct after December. She was ready. The morning of the 23rd she was up at 5. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table with the 5th legal pad, the 4th had been filled and filed with Gringotts as supporting documentation in October, and went through her notes one final time. Not because she needed to. Because the ritual of it settled something. Vernon came downstairs at 6, which was earlier than usual, and she looked up. He was dressed properly. Not in his grunting suit, something else, something she'd seen him wear to Dudley's school events, a dark jacket that fit him properly and made him look less like a man performing the idea of a businessman and more like a man who had been thinking carefully about the impression he wanted to make. "You don't have to come," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm coming." She looked at him for a moment. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who has been doing a great deal of thinking over the past several months and has arrived somewhere that he intends to occupy without apology. "Dudley," she said. "At my sister's," he said. He thinks we're visiting friends in London. All right, she said. She poured him a cup of tea. He sat down across from her and wrapped both hands around the mug and said, "Is there anything I need to know before we go in?" She looked at her legal pad. "The session today is specifically about the censure motion," she said. "The statute reinstatement is done, that's established. Today is about formal accountability for the suppression. Ragnarok has filed for a censure of the process and formal documentation of the 1971 vote's procedural failures. It's not about punishing anyone individually. It's about the record." "Dumbledore," Vernon said. "The record," she said. "His name will be in it because the evidence requires it. But we're not seeking his removal or sanction beyond the formal censure. Ragnarok has been very clear about limiting scope." "Why?" Vernon asked. Not challenging, genuinely curious. "Because the moment this becomes about punishing one man it stops being about fixing the system," she said. "And fixing the system is what matters." She paused. "Also because a censure motion aimed at destroying Dumbledore personally would lose votes it currently has and gain enemies we don't need." Vernon nodded. "Practical," he said. "Always," she said. They drank their tea in the early morning quiet and Petunia thought about how strange it was that this kitchen, this small, ordinary Muggle kitchen on a small, ordinary Muggle street, had become the operational center of the most significant legal challenge to wizarding institutional power in 50 years. She thought about Lily, who had sat at this table as a teenager before going home to Cokeworth for holidays, who had probably done homework here, who had never in her life been ordinary and had never stopped trying to make the world better for the fact of her being in it. She thought, "I'm finishing it. Properly this time." "Right," she said, and stood. "Let's go." Harry arrived at the ministry via a completely different route than his aunt. McGonagall had arranged it, a ministry visitor's pass for a Hogwarts student traveling during the Christmas holiday, filed through the proper channels with the proper paperwork, all of it entirely above board, which Harry suspected was itself a small message from McGonagall to the people watching the case. This is what proper process looks like. She'd also arranged his travel through the Floo network at Hogwarts, which was the first time Harry had used it and resulted in him arriving in the ministry atrium considerably more disheveled than he'd intended, covered in soot, facing the enormous gold fountain with its magical statues mid-arc. He straightened his collar. Brushed soot off his shoulder. Looked around. The atrium was busier than it had been in August. Ministry workers moving between departments, a cluster of witches in visiting robes near the security desk, 2 wizards having a very intense conversation near the lifts. The fountain caught the light. He found his aunt in the antechamber on the 3rd floor, where the Wisengamot held overflow seating for petitioners. She was sitting with Ragnarok and Millicent Hobb and a woman Harry didn't know who turned out to be Doris Purkis, a Muggle-born witch in her 50s who had been identified as one of the 47 documented families and who had agreed to speak today. Petunia looked up when he came in. Her eyes went briefly to the soot on his collar, which she apparently decided not to address. "You're here," she said. "Floo travel," he said. "I'm working on it." "Sit down." She handed him a document from the top of her stack. "This is the censure motion as filed. Read through the 3rd section before we go in. Ragnarok added an amendment Tuesday that's relevant to the guardianship designation review." He sat and read. Millicent was talking to Ragnarok in low, efficient tones about procedural sequencing. Vernon was sitting at the far end of the bench with the expression of a man carefully managing his own discomfort. He met Harry's eyes briefly and gave him a small, awkward nod. Harry nodded back. They hadn't had a real conversation yet. Not since everything. There were layers of years between them that neither of them had found the vocabulary for, and Harry thought that was probably a project for after today, not before it. What they had now was something very basic and functional, 2 people on the same side of something, present in the same room, moving in the same direction. It was not enough and it was not nothing. He read the amendment. Then he read it again. This adds the wardship review findings to the censure motion, he said. Yes, Ragnock said, without looking up from his own documents. So the memo, Harry started, is formally entered as supporting evidence, Ragnock said. The November 1981 memo from the Guardian representative regarding the privet drive placement. It becomes part of the censure record. Harry sat with that. The memo was dated the 4th of November, 1981. 4 days after Halloween. 4 days after his parents died, while he was presumably still in the hospital wing at Hogwarts or wherever they'd taken him, 3 days old and entirely unaware. Dumbledore had written a memo about efficiency. About keeping the Muggle household uninformed. He thought about his aunt reading that memo's contents when Ragnock had sent her the summary. He thought about what it must have felt like to see in writing, in ministry language, the administrative reasoning behind everything that had been withheld from her. He looked at her now. She was annotating something, her pen moving in the quick, precise way it always did, and her face was entirely composed. He thought, she's been carrying this for months and she has never once let it make her erratic. He thought, that is the most impressive thing I have ever seen a person do. The chamber was fuller than August. That was the first thing Harry noticed walking in. The upper benches were nearly at capacity. He counted quickly and estimated 65, maybe 70 members, against the 50-odd who'd been present in August. The additional members were not all favorable, he could see that. There were faces in the upper tier that had the tight, managed expressions of people who were here to defend something rather than adjudicate it. But they were here. They had felt the political weight of this session enough to come. That mattered. His aunt had told him it would. Marchbanks was presiding again. She looked, if anything, more focused than she had in August, the expression of a woman who has been doing procedural groundwork for 3 months and is ready to have the conversation that the groundwork was for. Dumbledore was present again in the observational capacity. His recusal from the vote stood. He was in the same position as August, far end of the upper bench, deep crimson robes, the measured gravity of his presence. He looked at Harry as Harry crossed the chamber floor, and Harry looked back, and neither of them looked away immediately. There was something different in Dumbledore's face today. Harry had been thinking about this since August, had turned it over in his mind during night flights and history of magic lessons and long evenings in the library, and he had landed on what it was. In August, Dumbledore had come to observe a process he expected to manage. He had sat in the chamber with the self-possession of a man whose power, while constrained, was ultimately still the largest power in the room. Today that quality was different in a way Harry couldn't entirely articulate. Not smaller. Not diminished. But the certainty had developed a texture, something that was not quite doubt but was doubt's immediate neighbor, the state of a man who has had 3 months to look at documented evidence of his own decisions and has been finding the looking harder than he expected. Harry held his gaze for a moment longer than was necessary. Not hostile. Just present. Then he sat down beside his aunt. She didn't look up from her documents but she said, quietly, "How is he?" "Thinking," Harry said. "Good," she said. "That's what we need him to be doing." Marchbanks called the session to order at 10 o'clock precisely and the chamber quieted immediately, the kind of quiet that happens in a room where people have been talking intently and stop all at once. The Wisengamot is convened for a continuation session regarding the Muggle-born and blood-adjacent protection statute of 1612, she said. The statute's reinstatement was confirmed at the previous session. Today's session addresses the censure motion filed by Advocate Ragnock on behalf of the petitioners, which concerns the procedural failures of the 1971 reclassification and their consequences. She looked around the chamber. We will hear opening remarks, documentary evidence, and 3 witness statements before the vote. We will then vote on the censure motion as filed, with the amendment of the 14th of December incorporated. She sat. Ragnock stood. He was, Harry thought, even more effective today than he had been in August. Perhaps because this session had a different quality. August had been about establishing facts, about demonstrating that the statute was real and enforceable and had been improperly suppressed. Today was about consequence. Today required a different kind of argument, not just analytical but moral, and Ragnarok made that turn with the ease of someone who has been building to it for months. The censure motion before this body, he said, is not punitive in the ordinary sense. It does not seek removal, sanction, or prosecution. It seeks something that is in many ways more difficult than any of those things. It seeks the record. An accurate, permanent, formally recognized account of what happened in 1971, why it happened, and what it cost. He paused. The magical world has a complicated relationship with its own history. It is very good at remembering its heroes and its catastrophes. It is considerably less good at remembering its administrative failures, the quiet, procedural moments in which institutions chose convenience over obligation and trusted that the people most affected would never be positioned to demand an accounting. He let that breathe. Those people, he said, are now demanding it. He walked through the documentary evidence in a presentation that was shorter than August's and more surgical. He had distilled 55 years of institutional failure into a sequence of 17 decisions, one for each provision, each one documented, each one traced from the 1971 vote to its specific practical consequence in a specific identified family's life. Not abstractions. Names, dates, harms. When he reached Provision 12, the right to a magical liaison for Muggle-born families, he cited a family from Yorkshire whose daughter had entered Hogwarts in 1975 and whose parents, having no liaison and no information, had spent 7 years believing their daughter was attending a boarding school in Scotland with unusual extracurricular programs. They had not known she was a witch until she was 23. The daughter, now in her late 30s, had submitted a written statement to the task group that Ragnarok read aloud, and the chamber was very quiet during it. When he reached Provision 17, the right to family notification in cases of ministry surveillance of a minor, he cited Harry's own case. Briefly, factually, without drama. Named the dates, named the surveillance arrangement on Wisteria Walk, named the memo. He read 4 sentences from the memo. Harry watched the upper benches while Ragnarok read. He watched the faces of the people who had come to defend something, and he saw the specific quality of expression that appeared when people who have been defending a position encounter evidence that makes the defense uncomfortable, not guilt, exactly, but the cognitive friction of fact against prior commitment. Several of them were very still. Ragnarok sat. Doris Purkis spoke first among the witnesses. She was a small woman with reading glasses and an air of restrained indignation that Harry thought was more powerful than outrage would have been. She spoke about her daughter, who had received her Hogwarts letter in 1982 and who had left for school while Doris had stood at King's Cross with absolutely no information about what the magical world was, where her daughter was going, or who she could contact if something went wrong. She spoke about the 3 years she'd spent before finding other Muggle-born families through purely accidental means and discovering that she was not alone in her ignorance. She spoke about the liaison she should have had, the consultation period she should have been offered, the 17 provisions that would have made her daughter's transition something other than an anxious disappearance into a world she had no map of. She was not performing grief or performing anger. She was simply describing what had happened, and the chamber heard it the way you hear a clear, true note. Vernon was next. He walked to the witness chair with his jaw set and his hands loose at his sides, and Harry thought he looked less frightened than he had in August, or rather, he looked frightened in a different way, the way of a man walking into something difficult on purpose rather than being caught out. He sat down and looked at Ragnarok. Ragnarok did not need to ask many questions. He simply asked Vernon to explain, in his own words and in his own time, what he understood now about the notifications he had signed. Vernon spoke for 11 minutes. He spoke about being 19 years old and receiving a form in the post that looked like a government communication. He spoke about checking the box and signing the form and putting it away because he had not understood it. He spoke about the second notification, when Harry had been born, and about the fact that he had known more by then, had known that magic was real, had known about the broader landscape, and had still not understood what he was waiving because the form had not told him and nobody had explained it. Then he said something that Harry had not expected. "I was ashamed," he said. The chamber was very quiet. "Of my blood. Of being whatever you'd call it, adjacent. It didn't feel like belonging to anything, it felt like being on the outside of two worlds at once. Too magical for the Muggle world if anyone found out, not magical enough for yours." He looked at his hands. "So I signed the forms and I didn't ask questions and I kept it all behind a skirting board and I told myself it didn't matter." He paused. "It mattered. I understand that now. What I signed affected my wife and it affected my nephew and they deserved to have the choice I never gave them." The silence after that was very complete. Harry looked at Petunia. She was looking at Vernon with an expression that was private and complicated and not for public consumption, and Harry looked away to give her the privacy of it. The ministry's representative had brought a different advocate this time, someone sharper than Fudge's cousin, a woman named Selwyn who asked precise questions with the quick energy of someone who had prepared properly. She challenged the evidence, she challenged the methodology of the task group census, she challenged the precedent cited for the censure motion. Ragnarok addressed each challenge with the patience of someone who has the documents and knows it. The cross-examination of Vernon was brief. Selwyn asked whether he had ever sought clarification about the forms at any point in the following 30 years. He said no. She asked whether he considered that a personal failure. He said yes, and then he said, "But the form should have been clear. A form that requires legal understanding to properly assess should say so. It didn't. That's the system's failure, not just mine." Selwyn sat down. The final witness was Petunia. She had not been listed as a witness in the original filing. Ragnarok had added her to the amended motion 2 weeks ago, a decision they had discussed at length and which she had ultimately agreed to because the amendment's addition of the wardship memo to the record meant that the personal dimension of the case, the specific experience of the woman who had received that note on the doorstep, needed a human face. She walked to the witness chair with the complete, unhurried composure of a woman entirely in command of herself, sat down, and looked at Ragnarok. He asked her 3 questions. The first, could she describe receiving Harry in November 1981? She described it. Factually. The note. The baby. The cold. The absence of any prior contact or consultation. She used precise language and she did not perform emotion about it, and the precision was more affecting than emotion would have been. The second, could she describe the conditions under which Harry had grown up in her household relative to what the statute would have provided? She described those too. The absence of a liaison. The absence of information about the blood wards. The absence of any ministry contact regarding Harry's status or welfare until the Hogwarts letter arrived. She described the 11 years not with self-flagellation, she was not going to perform guilt here, and it would have been dishonest if she had, but with the clear-eyed accuracy of a woman itemizing a deficit. This is what existed. This is what should have existed. This is the gap. The third question Ragnarok asked was not what Harry expected. "Mrs. Dursley," Ragnarok said, "why did you bring this petition?" She looked at him. She looked around the chamber, at the 60-odd members on the upper benches, at Marchbanks, at Millicent and Doris Purkis and Vernon at the petitioner's table, at Harry. When she looked at Harry, something shifted in her expression. Just briefly. Just for a moment. The public composure was exactly what it was, composed, managed, entirely real, and underneath it, visible for that single moment, was the actual woman, 51 years old, sitting in the most important room she had ever been in, looking at the boy who had her sister's eyes. Then she looked back at Ragnarok. "Because the magical world is full of extraordinary people," she said, "who have built extraordinary things and done extraordinary damage, often simultaneously, and nobody has ever made them account for the second part because the first part was too impressive." She paused. "I am not impressive. I am not magical. I am a Muggle woman with a legal pad and 30 years of paying attention. That combination turns out to be sufficient. She paused again. My sister was Lily Evans. She was the cleverest person I knew, and she identified the problem I've been describing 20 years ago and wrote 3 papers about it and was ignored. She died before she could do anything more about it. Her son, she stopped, very briefly, her son should not have had to grow up in ignorance of what he was and what he was owed. No child should. That's why I filed the petition. Because the statute exists. Because the rights are real. And because nobody else was going to do it. The chamber was entirely still. Marchbanks looked at her for a moment. Then, thank you, Mrs. Dursley. You may return to the petitioner's table. Petunia stood. She walked back to the table. She sat down beside Harry, and she did not look at him, and he did not say anything, and the thing that passed between them in that moment was not a conversation because it didn't need to be. The deliberations took 2 hours. Harry and Petunia and Vernon and Millicent sat in the antechamber and waited with the particular quality of stillness that comes from having done everything possible and arriving at the part where the outcome belongs to someone else. Ragnarok was inside. He had been invited to remain in the chamber as a representative of the petitioners during deliberation, which was unusual, and which he had accepted without comment. Millicent talked Doris Purkis through the compensation application process for her family's case, the documentation required, the timeline, the expected remedies. Doris had a notebook and wrote things down in the neat, emphatic handwriting of a woman who had been waiting for this conversation for years. Vernon sat near the door. At some point Harry got up and went and sat in the chair beside him, and they were both quiet for a while, and then Vernon said, gruffly, I should have done this differently. The notification. I should have told you what it was. Harry looked at him. Yeah, he said. You should have. I know. But you came today, Harry said. And you said what you said. That mattered. Vernon looked at his hands. I wasn't much of an uncle, he said. No, Harry said. You weren't. The honesty of it sat between them without drama. Harry didn't dress it up and Vernon didn't defend against it, and somehow that made the space between them more workable than it had ever been, the absence of the lie that had been sitting there for 11 years clearing the air for something that was not yet a relationship but was possibly the foundation of one. I'll do better, Vernon said. I'd like that, Harry said. Simply, because it was true. Not warmly, not with any more than it was. But true. Petunia, across the room, was watching them. When Harry caught her eye she looked back at her papers, and the small thing that moved in her face before she did was something he would turn over for a long time afterward. Ragnarok came out of the chamber at 1:30. He crossed the antechamber with his usual short, precise stride and stopped in front of the petitioners and said, the censure motion passes. 38 votes to 24, with 9 abstentions. Millicent exhaled. Doris closed her eyes for a moment. The censure is formal, Ragnarok continued. It enters the Wisengamot record as a documented procedural failure in the 1971 reclassification, with named responsibility attributed to the administrative process and its architects. The November 1981 memo is formally entered into the Wisengamot's historical record as a document of concern regarding wardship practices. He paused. The task group's compensation framework is formally adopted. Implementation begins in January. Vernon's eyes had gone a bit bright at the corners. He looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man managing himself. Petunia said, the dissent. 24 votes against. Expected, Ragnarok said. The opposition held its block. It will reduce over time as the compensation framework produces visible outcomes. We anticipated 26 against, Millicent said. 2 moved in the final vote. Yes, Ragnarok said, and his tone suggested he found this significant. 2 members who had been briefed against the motion voted for it in the chamber. He looked at Petunia. Your testimony moved the room. The evidence moved the room, she said. The evidence and your testimony, he said, with the precision of someone who would not let her give the evidence sole credit. Both. Petunia looked at him for a moment, and then she did something Harry had not seen her do in public before. She let her face go entirely still, dropped every managed quality of expression, and in that stillness was something that was just satisfaction, plain and real and earned. It lasted about 3 seconds and then the composure came back up. "Thank you," she said to Ragnarok. "For everything. For taking this on. I have been waiting 40 years for someone to bring me this case," he said, with perfect simplicity. "The thanks belong to you." They came out of the ministry into a London afternoon that was cold and grey and smelled of rain, and Doris Purkis shook Petunia's hand with both of hers and said something quietly that Harry didn't hear, and Millicent was already on a small pocket notebook making notes for January's implementation meetings, and Ragnarok departed with Sharpclaw toward a waiting ministry car that Harry suspected was something other than an ordinary car. Vernon was standing on the pavement looking at the sky in a way that suggested he needed a minute. Petunia let him have it. Harry stood beside her. The city moved around them, the permanent, indifferent machinery of London, black cabs and pigeons and people with shopping bags hurrying through the pre-Christmas bustle. "Is it done?" Harry asked. "The major architecture is done," she said. "The work isn't. The compensation applications, the revised arrival information for Muggle-born families, the wardship review process, that's months more. Years, for some of it. But the statute is reinstated," he said. "Formally censured. On the record." "Yes," she said. "All of that is permanent." He thought about Lily Evans at 17 writing 3 papers about exactly this problem. He thought about the ministry official who had buried them, who had been in Dumbledore's department, whose name was in the task group's record now even if it would never be in a newspaper. He thought about the gap between what should have been and what was, and the very specific kind of work it took to close it. "She would have been good at this," he said. "Mom. This kind of work." Petunia looked at him. "She would have been extraordinary at it," she said. "She was already good at 17. She identified it and you finished it," he said. The thing that crossed Petunia's face at that was complicated and large and she managed it with her usual efficiency, but not before he saw it. He thought it was possibly the most honest expression he had ever seen on her face, grief and love and something that had been closed for a very long time opening, carefully, into something else. "I suppose that's one way to look at it," she said. "It's the accurate way," he said. She looked at the pavement. Then she looked at him. "Your mother would have argued with me constantly," she said. "She would have had 17 better ideas and she would have been insufferably right about all of them." "She sounds brilliant," Harry said. "She was," Petunia said, and this time the level tone didn't cost her the same thing it used to. The grief was still in it, would always be in it, but it was sitting differently, not a wound managed by distance but something that had been looked at, directly, and had not destroyed her. She reached into her coat pocket and produced a small, wrapped package, which she handed to him. He looked at it. "What's this?" "Christmas," she said. "Open it now." He unwrapped it. Inside was a small photograph album, the Muggle kind, dark blue with a plain cover. He opened it. The photographs were Muggle photographs, so they didn't move. But they were organized, one per page, with small handwritten captions in Petunia's precise writing. Lily at various ages, the garden at Cokeworth, the kitchen table he recognized from Privet Drive, Hogwarts in the background of one, a seaside holiday at 8 or 9, a birthday at 12. James in 2 of them. A wedding photograph, his parents, young and luminous and entirely themselves. The last photograph was one he hadn't seen. Lily holding a baby, sitting in a garden Harry didn't recognize, autumn light catching her hair. Looking at the baby with an expression that was so particular and so complete that looking at it was almost too much. On the caption below, in Petunia's handwriting, Lily and Harry. Godric's Hollow. October 1981. He looked at it for a long time. I had that one in the back of the drawer, Petunia said, and her voice was perfectly level. I should have given it to you years ago. He closed the album carefully. He held it with both hands. Thank you, he said, and his voice came out slightly not his own, and he didn't try to fix it. She nodded once. Then she straightened her coat and looked at Vernon, who had finished collecting himself and was looking at them both with the expression of a man who had found himself, unexpectedly, in the middle of something far larger than he'd understood when he married into it. We should eat, Petunia said. I haven't eaten since 5 this morning. There's a place on the Strand, Vernon said, with the slightly uncertain helpfulness of a man trying to find his footing. You like that Italian one? Fine, she said. Yes. They began walking. The three of them, down a London street 2 days before Christmas, in the cold grey air, and Harry had the photo album under his arm and the photograph of Lily in his breast pocket and the knowledge that the statute was on the record and the work was going forward and the world was not fixed but was in the process of being fixed by people who had decided not to stop. He went back to Hogwarts the following week for the last few days of term. He had dinner with McGonagall on his first evening back. He told her about the vote. He told her about Vernon's testimony and his aunt's and the 38-24 margin. He told her about the photo album. McGonagall listened to all of it without speaking, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment and then she said, Your mother wrote in her 3rd paper, the one she submitted in her final year, that the magical world's greatest failure was not its enemies but its habit of treating its own members as means rather than ends. People to be moved around rather than consulted. Convenient arrangements rather than lives. She was right, Harry said. She was right, McGonagall agreed. And you, and your aunt, have put that argument in the formal record of the Wiesengemot. That is a different thing from being right. That is being right in a way that has permanent consequences. He thought about that. Dumbledore, he said. Do you think he understands what happened? Not the legal mechanics. The actual thing. McGonagall was quiet for a moment. Outside her window the Scottish winter was doing something dramatic with the sky, heavy clouds moving fast over the mountains, the last of the afternoon light going orange and cold. I think, she said carefully, that he is a man who has spent his entire life being right about the important things. Not all the important things. But enough of them. And the experience of being right about enough important things can make it very difficult to see the important things you've been wrong about. She paused. I think the last 3 months have been instructive for him. Whether instructive is enough, I don't know. He came to see me, Harry said. In November. We had a conversation. McGonagall looked at him sharply. He came to the school. He asked to meet. I agreed. We talked for about an hour in a room near the library. He looked at his tea. He told me things about my parents. Real things, not the version that made his decisions convenient, actual things. He told me about the night my father stood up to a group of Death Eaters in Diagon Alley in 1978 and the way he laughed about it afterwards. He told me about my mother arguing with him about curriculum changes in her 7th year and being entirely correct. He paused. He also told me he was sorry. About the note on the doorstep. McGonagall was very still. What did you say? I said I appreciated him telling me, Harry said. I said sorry didn't undo anything but it was a better place to be than not saying it. He looked up. And then I told him that my aunt would be sending the task group's January report to him directly, because she thought he should read every word of it. McGonagall's expression moved through something complex and arrived at something that was unmistakably, unguardedly warm. Good, she said. That's exactly right. I think he seemed relieved, Harry said. Not about the work. About, I don't know. Being asked to read something instead of being excluded from it. That sounds like him, McGonagall said softly. He's not a villain, Harry said. It wasn't a defense. Just an observation, arrived at through paying attention. He's a man who made himself the center of too many systems and kept the information in too few hands and called it protection. But he's not, he stopped. It's more complicated than a villain. Yes, McGonagall said. It usually is. They finished their tea and Harry went back to the common room, where Ron was waiting with a chessboard and Hermione had found a textbook they weren't studying until second year and had opinions about it, and the fire was going, and outside the castle windows the Scottish winter was moving fast across the mountains. He sat with his friends. He played chess badly and lost quickly and didn't particularly mind. He told Hermione about the censure vote and she asked 17 precise questions and then went off to find the archived text of the vote to read it herself, which was entirely on brand. He had the photo album in his trunk. He had the photograph in his breast pocket. He had letters from his aunt going back to September in a folder labeled PD that was on its second volume. He had a goblin advocate who updated him regularly on compensation applications and a professor who had 40 years of institutional memory and a former archivist whose copies of everything were, he suspected, going to be relevant for years. He had, for the first time in his life, the full and specific knowledge of what he was, where he came from, and what had been done in his name and without his knowledge, and that knowledge was not comfortable but it was his, and nobody had given it to him. He and his aunt had taken it, carefully and legally and one documented step at a time, from a system that had preferred him not to have it. He thought about Lily Evans at 17 with her notebook full of proposals, writing about the gap between what the magical world promised and what it delivered, sending the papers off and hearing nothing, not knowing that 40-some years later her son would be sitting in the common room she'd sat in while her sister's work put those proposals in the permanent record. He thought that she would have had opinions about all of it. He thought she would have been both appalled and proud, and that the proud was louder. He looked at the fire and thought, we're not done. The compensation applications, the revised information for Muggle-born families, the wardship review process. January, and the month after, and the year after that. He thought, good. There's more to do. He thought, we'll do it. Outside, the Scottish winter moved across the mountains without particular interest in what was happening in the castle, and inside, the fire burned, and the work continued, and Harry Potter, 11 years old, with his mother's photograph in his pocket and his aunt's letters in his trunk, settled into the chair by the hearth and opened a book and read until the common room emptied and the fire burned low, and was not afraid of anything. The task group delivered its first compensation acknowledgments to 11 families in January. The documents were formal and carried the Wisengamot seal and said, in the precise language of institutional reckoning, the Ministry of Magic acknowledges that you were entitled to protections you were not given and rights you were not told about. We are sorry for that. Here is what we are doing to fix it. Petunia received a copy. She read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with her tea. She read it twice. Then she got out the 6th legal pad, opened it to the first page, and wrote at the top, Phase 2, Full Census and Compensation, Families 12 to 47. Below that, after a moment, she wrote, Lily's Proposals, Formal Adoption into Muggle-born Arrival Guidelines. Timeline? She underlined the second item. Put the pen down. Looked at the January light coming through the kitchen window. Then she picked the pen back up and got to work.